I was 34 when I took a solo camping trip into the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho. It was late September of 2019. I picked that time because it was just past the busy season. Most people were done with summer camping, and hunting season hadn't fully kicked in yet. I wanted quiet, space, and a couple of days with no phone service. I had a stressful job managing a warehouse near Boise, and between the noise, the people, and the long shifts, I needed a real break. I'd been camping all my life, though mostly in groups. This was the first time I'd be doing it completely alone. I picked a spot about 8 miles off a logging road that wasn't on any official campground map. I found it a couple of years before while hiking with my cousin. It was near a creek, flat enough to set up comfortably, and surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. It was a beautiful and private spot, and I'd made a mental note to come back one day. I drove out in my old Tacoma on a Wednesday morning, stopping in Hamilton for fuel and some last-minute groceries. Things like trail mix, tortillas, tuna packs, and coffee. I packed light: a 2-person tent, a foam pad, a cold-rated sleeping bag, a headlamp, a small hatchet, my jet boil, a bare canister for food, and my Glock 19. I wasn't worried about people, but you never really know who or what might be out there. I also brought a GPS beacon that could ping my location and send an SOS if I held the button long enough. Other than that, I turned my phone off before I even left the pavement. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. I parked off a gravel spur near a trailhead that hadn't been maintained in years. The trail was overgrown in places and scattered with broken branches, but I knew where I was going. The air had that cold, clean smell you only get in the mountains in early fall. No bugs, just crisp wind and the sound of my boots hitting packed dirt and pine needles. The forest was dense, quiet. I didn't see a single person or hear anything other than birds and squirrels rustling through the brush. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was sinking behind the peaks to the west. The light turned everything gold and orange. I dropped my pack and looked around. The place hadn't changed. Same fallen log by the creek, same flat patch of grass, same quiet. I set up my tent near a large boulder that blocked some of the wind and stashed my food canister about 30 yards away. Then I gathered some dry wood, got a small fire going, and made a quick dinner. Just tuna in a tortilla, washed down with cold instant coffee. Not gourmet, but filling. That night was cold but peaceful. The sky was completely clear, and the stars looked endless. I stayed up by the fire until it burned down to glowing coals, then crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep almost instantly. The only sound was the creek running nearby. I woke up early the next morning. It was still dark, but I had to pee. I slipped out of my bag, unzipped the tent, and stepped into the cold. My breath came out in clouds. I didn't bring a watch, but I guessed it was around 5 a.m. I wandered a little away from the tent to do my business, then stood still for a minute, just listening. There was nothing out of place, just the usual breeze through the trees and water over rocks. I crawled back into the tent and dozed off again. When I woke for good, the sun was high, and everything outside had that bright, chilly look. I made coffee and sat by the creek, eating a granola bar and watching the water. A hawk flew overhead. Everything felt right. Later that morning, I decided to hike farther up into the ridges above my site. I packed some snacks, extra water, my GPS beacon, and my sidearm just in case. The path up was steep, but I took my time. I saw elk tracks, some bear scat that looked a few days old, and a couple of squirrels that barked at me from the trees. It was peaceful. I spent a couple of hours exploring and got back to camp around 2 p.m. That's when I noticed something strange. My food canister was still right where I'd left it, unopened. But next to it, in the dirt, were footprints. Not animal prints. These were boot prints. Heavy, deep ones. They weren't mine. I could tell because the tread was different. Mine had a narrow vibram pattern. These were wide, blocky, and deeper. I looked around for more. There were a few leading toward the trees, but nothing in the direction of my tent. My first thought was that a hunter might have wandered through. It happens even way out here, but most hunters wear blaze orange, and I would have heard them if they got that close. These prints were about a size 12 and spaced close together like the person had been walking slowly. I felt uneasy, but there was no sign of anything missing or disturbed. The fire pit looked the same, my tent was zipped shut, and nothing inside had been touched. I sat on a log and thought about it for a while. Maybe someone came through earlier in the morning, saw my setup, and kept going. Maybe they were just curious. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching. I went over to the trees where the prints led and followed them for a few yards. They stopped near a thick patch of brush and vanished. No other signs, no cigarette butts, wrappers, or anything like that. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I stayed put and kept my Glock nearby that night. I didn't start a fire. I figured if someone was out there, I didn't want to advertise myself again. I ate a cold dinner and kept my ears open. It got dark fast. I stayed awake longer than I normally would have, listening to every sound outside the tent. Wind, twigs snapping, distant owls. At one point, I heard a soft crunch, like a footstep, but nothing followed. I stayed completely still. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it wasn't restful. The next morning, I felt groggy and tense. I made coffee and considered packing up, but the weather was perfect, and part of me wanted to believe I was just being paranoid. I walked a wide loop around my campsite, looking for more signs of anyone. Nothing. No new prints, no trash, no markers. Just trees and dirt. By midday, I had calmed down again. I cooked some instant rice with jerky and sat on a log watching the creek. That's when I noticed something else. Wedged between two rocks near the edge of the water was a piece of fabric. It looked like camo and it was soaked. Pulled it out. It was part of a sleeve, maybe from a jacket or shirt, torn and frayed at the edge. No blood, no tag, just dirty and wet. I didn't recognize it, and I hadn't seen it the day before. That was enough for me. I packed everything fast. I took down the tent, jammed my gear into my pack, and made sure nothing was left behind. Then I started hiking out. The trail felt different now, less quiet, more watched. I kept my hand near my holster the entire way. About a mile from where I parked, I saw movement ahead. I froze. It was a man, crouched near a tree about 50 yards off the trail. He wasn't wearing hunter orange, just dull brown and green, like he was trying to blend in. His head was down, and he was doing something on the ground, maybe tying a boot or adjusting something. I didn't call out. I stepped back behind a tree, heart pounding. He hadn't seen me. I waited. After about a minute, he stood and walked the other way, deeper into the woods. He moved slowly, carefully. I stayed frozen for a while after he disappeared. Eventually, I kept walking. I stayed on the trail, moving as fast as I could without making noise. I didn't stop until I saw my truck. When I got to it, everything looked normal. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a while with the engine running. I didn't see anyone. I drove straight back to Boise without stopping. I didn't tell anyone right away, just showered, ate a real meal, and slept for almost 12 hours. A few days later, I called the local ranger station. I didn't say much, just that I'd seen someone acting suspicious off a logging trail and found a piece of torn clothing. They thanked me and said they'd send someone to check it out. I never followed up. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone. I still go with friends, and I still love the outdoors, but something about that trip left a mark. Whoever that was out there wasn't just passing through. I don't know what they were doing or why they were so quiet, but I'm glad I left when I did. The way I see it, the wilderness has all kinds of people in it. Some out there for the same reasons as me, and some with reasons you don't want to understand. I trusted my gut, and it probably saved me. That was the last time I ignored that feeling. In the summer of 2017, I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the national forest near Windendale, Oregon. I was 33 at the time, working a warehouse job in Tacoma. I'd saved up enough vacation time to take a week off, and I wanted to spend it away from everything. No phones, no people, no traffic, just trees, air, and quiet. I'd been into hiking and camping since I was a teenager, and I had all the gear. I wasn't inexperienced, but I'd never camped completely alone for more than a night or two. This time, I planned on staying out for 5 days. I figured it would give me the solitude I'd been needing for a long time. I packed everything up the night before: tent, sleeping bag, bear canister, stove, water filter, maps, compass, headlamp, emergency radio, and all the usual stuff. I had backup batteries for everything and a heavy-duty power bank, though I intended to keep my phone turned off. I also had a hatchet and a large fixed-blade knife I kept in a sheath on my belt. They weren't for defense, just part of basic camping equipment. I had no reason to think I'd need to defend myself from anything other than maybe a stubborn root while chopping kindling. I drove out early the next morning, following the highway for a couple hours before turning onto a narrower road that twisted into the mountains. It was paved for the first few miles, then turned into gravel. I followed it past the official campsites and the RV spots, farther into the woods than I'd ever been before. Eventually, I reached a dead end where a rough dirt road branched off and led to an old logging trail. I parked off to the side and locked the car. From there, I hiked in with a full pack, maybe 6 or 7 miles, following the old trail until even that disappeared into overgrowth. I wanted to be far away from anyone else. The spot I chose was a small clearing beside a slow-moving stream. There were signs that elk had been through, some scat, a few shallow tracks, but otherwise it looked untouched. The trees were mostly Douglas fir, tall and thick, and the canopy let in just enough light. The stream was cold, clear, and just wide enough to splash some water over my face. I pitched my tent on slightly raised ground and made a small fire ring from stones nearby. Everything was perfect. That first evening, I ate some dehydrated chili, drank filtered stream water, and sat in silence as the sun went down behind the ridgeline. That night, I slept like a rock. I didn't hear a thing, not even the wind. It was the kind of silence you only get deep in the woods, where the nearest human is probably 10 miles away. When I woke up the next morning, the ground was damp from dew, and the air smelled fresh like pine needles and wet dirt. I made coffee, had some oatmeal, and set off on a small hike upstream, just exploring. I didn't bring anything except my knife and a water bottle. I spent a few hours walking, taking note of landmarks. An oddly twisted tree, a pile of moss-covered stones, a natural shelf of rock near the stream bend. It was around noon when I turned back. On the way back to camp, I noticed something strange. A cluster of boot prints on a flat patch of ground just off the trail. They weren't mine. They were old but still visible. The pattern was deeper than mine, too. Maybe someone wearing heavier boots. I crouched and looked at them closer. They weren't fresh, maybe a few days old. Not alarming, just unusual. I hadn't passed any other hikers, and I was well beyond any maintained trail. Still, the forest is big. Maybe someone else had camped out here and moved on. Back at camp, I had a snack, filtered some more water, and spent the rest of the afternoon reading a paperback I'd brought along. Around 5, I collected firewood, stacked it near the pit, and got a small fire going. I cooked some rice and beans on the stove and watched the light fade again. Everything was quiet. Not a single bug, not a single breeze. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But I chalked it up to being so far out and tried not to overthink it. That night, I woke up once. It was probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. I didn't have a watch on me and I didn't check my phone. I woke up because I heard something, a branch snapping. Not close, but not too far either. I sat up, listening hard. Nothing, just that one sound. Then silence again. No footsteps, no rustling, just that one crack. I stayed still for a few minutes, listening to the dark, but I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I laid back down and closed my eyes. I was used to forest sounds, but something about this one stuck with me. It had sounded intentional, clean, like weight had broken it. The next morning, I checked around the campsite but didn't find anything out of place. I walked the edge of the clearing, looked for fresh tracks, but all I saw were mine and the old elk signs. Maybe a branch just fell. Still, I kept my knife on me the rest of the day, even when I was just reading or boiling water. It made me feel a little more grounded. That evening, I hiked a bit farther from camp, found a few more interesting landmarks, and came back just before sunset. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept thinking about those boot prints, about how someone else had been out here recently, and how I hadn't seen a trace of them since. No fire pits, no garbage, no obvious path in or out. Just that one cluster of prints. It got in my head, and I couldn't get it out. The fire I built that night was bigger than usual. I sat closer to it, kept checking the tree line, kept listening for sounds. It was too quiet. I went to bed around midnight but barely slept. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard something again. This time it was closer. 2 separate steps. Crunch, crunch. Then nothing. I sat up, my heart hammering. I didn't unzip the tent, just stayed frozen, listening. The footsteps hadn't been close enough to be right outside the tent, but they were in the clearing, that I was sure of. I stayed up for what felt like hours, gripping the knife handle under my sleeping bag. Eventually, morning came. When I got up, everything looked the same. Nothing moved, nothing taken, no footprints I could find. The ground was hard enough that tracks didn't show well unless it had just rained. Still, the feeling in my gut told me I wasn't imagining it. I spent most of that day close to camp. I didn't hike. I didn't explore. I boiled water, cleaned gear, sharpened my knife, and packed a few essentials into my day pack just in case. By sunset, I'd made up my mind. I'd stay one more night, and if anything else happened, I'd cut the trip short. That final night, I didn't sleep. I just lay there, fully dressed, my boots on, knife on my chest, backpack half-zipped beside me. I kept the tent flap slightly open so I could peek out. The moon was out, bright enough to see faint outlines of trees. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement, just a flicker at first, a shape in the trees. I froze. It was a man, just standing there at the edge of the clearing. No flashlight, no pack. He wasn't facing me directly, just standing, half-turned, like he was looking toward the fire ring. I couldn't see his face. He didn't move. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. After maybe a full minute, he turned and slowly walked back into the trees. No sound at all. Just gone. I waited another hour before I moved. I packed up everything as fast and quietly as I could. No stove, no repacking food, just the tent, sleeping bag, knife, map, compass, water. I strapped it all tight and headed out before dawn. I didn't take the trail I came in on. I bushwhacked toward the nearest ridge where I knew there was an old fire road. I pushed through brambles, slid down muddy slopes, crossed cold streams, and didn't stop moving until the sun was fully up. It took me almost 8 hours to reach a ranger station near a campground on the opposite end of the forest. I must have looked like hell. Mud on my pants, scratches on my arms, sweat-drenched shirt. I told them I had gotten turned around and needed help getting back to my car. They didn't ask questions. One of them gave me water and a ride in his pickup back around the range. I didn't tell them about the man. I didn't tell anyone for a while. When I got back to my car, everything was untouched, locked, no signs of anything. I drove home, still shaken, every bump in the road making my stomach lurch. I don't know who that man was. Maybe a squatter, maybe someone hiding out, maybe someone worse. But he wasn't lost and he wasn't camping. He didn't have gear. He wasn't there by accident. He knew where I was. He'd been watching. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike. I still love the forest. But now I stay closer to marked trails. I carry a GPS beacon, and I never ignore that gut feeling again. That trip gave me what I was looking for, solitude. But it also showed me something else. You can be as far away from civilization as you want, but you're never really alone out there. Some people don't want to be found, and sometimes they find you. I was 32 in the summer of 2019, and I'd been going on solo camping trips for the last 5 years. I started doing them after a rough breakup and never really stopped. Something about being alone in the woods, away from everything, just gave me peace. I lived in northern Colorado back then, in a town called Latham, not far from the Wyoming border. Most of my trips were short, 1 or 2 nights, but this one was meant to be a full 4-day stretch. No cell service, no GPS, just a topo map, compass, and my usual gear. That July, I picked a remote spot in Medicinebound National Forest, a place I'd hiked through a few times but never camped in. It was high up, elevation around 9,000 feet, and far enough from any trailhead that I knew I wouldn't run into other people. I parked my truck off a Forest Service road around noon, packed up my bag, and hiked 5 miles in. I took my time, stopping to filter water and check the map every so often. And by late afternoon, I reached a spot I'd marked earlier in the week. A flat, shaded clearing near a small creek, ringed by lodgepole pines and spruce. There were signs of deer, but nothing recent. No trash, no footprints, just how I liked it. I set up my tent about 10 yards from the creek and got my little camp stove going to make some rice and lentils. I kept everything tidy. Food in a bear canister, trash bagged up, no scented stuff left out. Years of doing this taught me to respect the woods, and I'd never had problems with wildlife beyond the occasional curious raccoon or chipmunk. The first night was calm. I slept light, like I always do when I'm out there, but nothing strange happened. The wind blew a little through the trees, and I heard owls once or twice. I woke up just after sunrise, made oatmeal and coffee, and spent most of the morning hiking uphill from camp. There was a small ridge with views of the valley below, and I sat up there for an hour watching hawks glide over the trees. I got back to camp around 2 in the afternoon and found something off. Nothing dramatic, just small things I noticed because I'm so used to this routine. My camp chair had been moved slightly, like it had been bumped. One of my hiking poles, which I left leaned against a tree, was on the ground. I told myself it was probably wind or maybe a squirrel. Still, I walked the perimeter of my camp just to check for tracks. I didn't see anything obvious, but the ground was hard and dry. That night, I kept my headlamp nearby and my knife under my sleeping pad, which I always do anyway. I made a bigger fire than usual, maybe just to feel more comfortable. The forest felt quiet. Too quiet. Not in a movie-style ominous way, but in the way where you start to realize how far you are from anyone. No planes overhead, no distant cars, not even the chirp of crickets. I stared at the fire longer than I needed to, finished my dinner slowly, then finally crawled into the tent just after 10. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. No dream, no noise, just awake. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it. A footstep. A slow, careful step not 20 feet away. Just one. Then nothing. I held my breath. I thought it might be a deer, but deer move in bursts. They're not that quiet. I waited, barely blinking, straining to hear anything else. After maybe 10 minutes of silence, I reached for my knife and slid it beside me, blade still in the sheath. I didn't sleep again until dawn. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Nothing looked disturbed. I walked a wide circle again, farther this time, maybe 100 feet out. That's when I saw a boot print. Just one, near the edge of the clearing, pointing toward my camp. It was old-style tread, deep heel, narrow toe, the kind of print left by someone wearing hiking boots. Not mine, I checked. My tread was broader. I took a picture of it with my phone even though I had no service. Then I erased all signs of my camp, hid my gear in a hollow log a short walk away, and hiked a zigzag pattern up a nearby ridge to see if anyone was around. Nothing. Not a soul. No tents, no smoke, no movement. I sat up there with my binoculars for a couple hours. Still nothing. Around noon, I went back, unpacked my stuff, and made lunch, acting like I hadn't seen anything. But I felt different. Less like I was camping, more like I was waiting for something to happen. I didn't sleep the third night either. I kept waking up to small sounds. Nothing clear, just twigs snapping or the faint sound of a branch moving. Could have been anything. But when you hear those things after finding a boot print that isn't yours, they start to mean more. Around 4:30 a.m., I thought I saw movement near the creek, a quick shadow. When I turned on my headlamp, there was nothing. I walked down there with my knife drawn. Still nothing. No tracks, no splash marks, no smell of wet clothes. Just my reflection in the water and a cold breeze that came out of nowhere. At dawn, I packed everything. I didn't even make breakfast, just filled my bottles and left. I took a longer way back, off trail for most of it, keeping to ridges and rocky areas where I wouldn't leave footprints. I didn't feel safe on the path. I don't know why, but I felt watched. 3 hours into my hike out, I saw a structure through the trees. It wasn't marked on my map, and it looked old. Maybe an old ranger cabin or fire lookout base, mostly collapsed. I wanted to keep walking, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached it slowly, scanning the ground. There were no fresh tracks, but the doorframe looked recently disturbed, like someone had leaned on it or passed through. Inside, it was dark and smelled like mold and old wood. There were signs someone had used it recently. An old steel thermos in the corner, empty, a burnt-out candle on a flat stone, even a pile of firewood stacked neatly by the broken wall. I didn't stay long. I took another picture and kept moving. When I reached my truck, I checked the bed and cab carefully before getting in. Everything was how I left it. I drove straight to the ranger station 10 miles south and showed them the boot print photo and the one of the structure. The guy behind the desk didn't seem surprised. He said there were reports now and then of squatters or off-grid loners moving through the forest, sometimes living in old shelters from the mining days. He said they rarely bothered campers, but if someone was watching me, it was smart to leave. That should have been the end of it. But the next week, something strange happened. I uploaded the photos from my trip to my computer and went through them to delete duplicates. When I zoomed in on one I took from the ridge, the one where I was watching the valley, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near the tree line on the far end of the photo, almost at the edge, there was a figure. Just a faint shape. Upright. Human. Standing still. Not moving, not walking. Watching in my direction. I checked the metadata. The photo was taken the morning after I found the boot print. I don't camp alone anymore. I still hike, still love the forest, but I stay on marked trails and stick to popular areas. I sleep in my truck if I need to. I've thought about that trip hundreds of times since it happened, and I always come back to the same feeling. Not fear exactly, but unease. The forest is vast, and you never know who else might be out there. Some people go into the woods to find peace. Others go to disappear, and some are already there, watching, waiting for you to turn your back. I never found out who it was. I never saw a face, never heard a voice. Just the signs, the boot print, the candle, the shape in the distance. But that was enough. That was more than enough. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to take a break from my usual city life and head out for a solo camping trip. I was 27 years old, working in a small publishing company in Cincinnati, Ohio, and the stress was getting to me. The noise, the people, the endless hours in a cramped office. Everything felt suffocating. I needed to get away, clear my head, and reconnect with something quieter, something simpler. I picked a spot in the Wayne National Forest in the southeastern part of Ohio, about 2.5 hours from where I lived. The forest was huge, covering over 250,000 acres of rolling hills, dense woods, and winding creeks. It wasn't as popular as some of the other parks nearby, which was exactly what I wanted. I liked the idea of being somewhere I could hear my own thoughts without interruption. The forest promised quiet and solitude. I set off early one Friday morning in mid-July. The sun was already warm through the windshield as I drove down the winding roads that led into the forest. I packed light, a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for moderate summer temperatures, a small stove, some canned beans, a couple of sandwiches, a thermos of coffee, water bottles, and a few essentials like a flashlight, a first aid kit, a map, and a compass. I had also brought a pocket knife and some rope, just in case. My phone had no signal there, but I didn't mind. I wanted to disconnect. The drive ended at a small parking lot marked Green Hollow Trailhead. From there, I lugged my backpack about a mile down a narrow dirt path. The forest was dense, mostly oak and maple trees with thick underbrush. Birds chirped intermittently, and the occasional rustle of squirrels and chipmunks kept me company. I felt lighter with every step away from the parking lot, away from the cars, the road noise, and the crowds. I found a flat clearing about a quarter mile off the trail, near a small creek. The spot was perfect, shaded by tall trees, soft grass underfoot, and with the creek's gentle babbling as a natural soundtrack. I set up my tent quickly, making sure the rainfly was taut. The summer air was warm but not uncomfortable, and a light breeze moved through the leaves above me. By mid-afternoon, I had gathered some dry wood and started a small fire in a fire ring I found there, probably left by other campers. The fire crackled and popped, and I boiled water for coffee on my small stove. Sitting on a fallen log by the fire, I took out my notebook and started writing. I hadn't journaled in years, but out here it felt right. The words came slow and steady as I wrote about the trees, the creek, the feeling of being alone. As the sun moved lower in the sky, I cooked some beans and ate them slowly, savoring the taste. There was no rush out here. I washed up with some water from the creek, careful not to disturb the small fish and insects in the shallow pools. By the time night began to fall, the forest was quiet except for the sounds of the fire and the creek. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and lay back in the tent, listening to the night. The first night was peaceful. I slept well, woken only briefly by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. When I woke the next morning, the sun was just breaking through the trees. I felt refreshed. I made coffee again and ate some bread and peanut butter. I took my time, soaking in the quiet beauty of the forest. I spent the second day hiking a little further down the creek, following it as it twisted through the trees. The forest here felt ancient and thick. The trees were taller, the shadows deeper, and the air cooler near the water. I saw deer tracks in the mud near the water's edge and a flash of a red fox slipping through the underbrush. I took pictures with my old film camera, something else I hadn't done in years. The whole day passed without incident, just the simple rhythms of the forest. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire and watched the flames dance. The stars were bright and clear through gaps in the treetops, and the air smelled of pine and earth. I felt at peace, but it was on the third night that things started to change. Earlier that day, I had wandered further off the trail, about 2 miles from my camp. I wanted to explore a ridge I'd spotted on my map, thinking the view might be good. The hike was harder than I expected. Steeper slopes, more rocks and roots to dodge, thicker brush. I was careful, moving slowly and marking my route on the map. When I finally reached the ridge, the view was breathtaking. The forest stretched out like a vast green ocean under the summer sky. I sat on a large rock and rested, drinking some water and feeling a quiet thrill of accomplishment. I took some more photos and then headed back, making sure to follow the landmarks I'd noted on the way up. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was low. I lit the fire and prepared a simple dinner. The forest around me seemed darker somehow, the shadows longer and heavier. A light wind stirred the leaves in an irregular rhythm. I noticed small noises I hadn't paid attention to before, the snapping of twigs, the soft shuffling of something moving through the underbrush just out of sight. I brushed it off as just animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe coyotes. That was normal. As I settled into my sleeping bag that night, I felt a little uneasy. The forest noises were louder than before, closer. I tried to tell myself it was just the usual sounds, amplified by the quiet around me. But just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping, very close to the edge of my clearing. My heart jumped, and I froze. I listened carefully, my breath slow and shallow. Nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was probably a falling branch or a small animal. I turned over and tried to sleep, but the snapping noises came again, irregular now, sometimes far, sometimes near. It was as if someone or something was moving around my campsite, stepping lightly but deliberately. I sat up, flashlight in hand, shining the beam out into the dark. The forest was empty, just trees and shadows. No eyes reflected back, no shapes moved. The air felt colder now, a chill that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I zipped up my sleeping bag tight around my shoulders and tried to stay calm. Then something else caught my attention, the smell. It was faint at first, a sour, sharp smell, like burnt rubber mixed with damp earth. Came and went with the breeze. I didn't understand it. I lay back down, eyes wide open, listening for any more noises. The snapping continued, and every so often, a low rustle, like heavy leaves being dragged or something brushing against branches. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to leave. I had planned to stay one more night, but after the strange noises and smells, I felt unsafe. I ate a quick breakfast and started hiking back toward the trailhead. On the way, I noticed something odd. Along the path, scattered among the usual fallen leaves and sticks, were small piles of blackened, charred wood, much smaller than firewood I'd collected. It looked like someone had burned bits of something carefully and left the remains there. There were also strange marks on the trees near the piles, scratches, deep gouges in the bark. They didn't look like animal scratches. They were too deliberate, too straight. A knot tightened in my stomach. The further I walked, the more of these piles and marks I saw, until finally I came to a clearing where I saw what had to be the source of the smell from last night. On the ground, half covered with dirt and leaves, were pieces of a burnt plastic container, twisted metal scraps, and a small, broken electronic device that looked like a handheld radio or pager from the early 90s. It was blackened and melted in parts. Nearby, the ground was disturbed. Footprints in the soft earth that weren't mine and not like any animal prints I knew. The shapes were elongated, about 10 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They weren't human either, at least not like a normal person's footprints. My mind raced, trying to figure it out. I wasn't the first person here. Someone had been making fires, burning things, maybe even living rough in the forest. But who? How long? And why so close to the trail? The forest suddenly felt much less friendly. I hurried back to the trailhead, my heart pounding. I kept my eyes on the ground, watching for any more signs. The trail was quiet except for the usual sounds of birds and wind. When I reached the parking lot, relief flooded me. The presence of other cars, even a couple of people walking dogs, was oddly comforting after the isolation. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the marks, the burnt piles, the strange footprints. Something had been out there watching or lurking, and maybe even trying to hide. Maybe it was someone camping illegally or someone living rough, or maybe it was a group that came into the forest for some purpose I couldn't guess. I called the ranger station later that day to report what I'd seen. They told me they had heard reports of trespassers and occasional squatters in that part of the forest, but nothing serious. The forest was vast, and some areas were hard to patrol. I never went back there. The experience changed how I saw camping. I learned that nature is It was late summer, 1998, when I decided to go camping by myself in the remote wilderness of northern Idaho. I was 25, working a quiet office job in Spokane, and craving a break from the monotony of city life. The idea was simple. Just me, a tent, a sleeping bag, and the wild forest for company. No distractions, no noise, just nature and silence. The plan was to spend 4 days deep in the woods near Priest Lake, a spot known for its thick pines, rocky terrain, and a few small, hidden lakes. I'd been there once before with friends, but this time I wanted to be alone, to push myself to live simply and prove I could handle the wilderness on my own. I packed my old, beaten-up backpack carefully the night before, making sure to include the essentials. A good sleeping bag, a sturdy tent, food for 4 days, a portable stove, some water bottles, a first aid kit, and a good hunting knife I'd inherited from my grandfather. I also brought a map and compass, figuring I didn't want to rely on a GPS that might fail or lose signal. The gear was heavy, but I felt ready. I drove up early Saturday morning. The road twisted through tall evergreens, following the lake shore until I hit a small dirt trail that led away from the main road and into the heart of the forest. From there, I had about a 6-mile hike to reach the spot I'd picked on the map, a flat clearing beside a quiet little lake called Moonwater. The walk itself was tough. The path was overgrown in places, uneven with roots and rocks, and sometimes it felt like the trees closed in around me, blocking the sun. But I was used to hiking, and the fresh air helped me push on. By late afternoon, I finally found the clearing. It was just like I remembered, peaceful and almost perfect for camping. The lake was calm, reflecting the bright blue sky and the tall trees around it. A light breeze stirred the leaves. I could hear the faint buzz of insects and the distant call of a hawk overhead. No other campers, no sounds of vehicles or people. I took a deep breath, feeling that mixture of relief and excitement you get when you're finally somewhere truly quiet. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was tight and secure against any wind. The ground was soft with pine needles, and I laid my sleeping bag inside, organizing my things so everything was easy to reach. Then I collected some dry wood and started a small fire. Cooking that first meal, pumpkin stew warmed over the flames, felt like a real accomplishment. After eating, I sat by the fire watching the water shimmer as the sun began to lower, turning the sky shades of pink and orange. Night fell quickly. The forest sounds changed. The daytime birds grew quiet, and the chorus of insects took over. Occasionally, I heard the snap of a twig somewhere deeper in the woods. I wasn't worried, this was normal. I was alert but calm, tucked safely inside my tent once the fire died down, falling asleep to the soft rustling of leaves and the faint sounds of the lake lapping against the shore. The next day, I decided to explore a bit. I woke early, made coffee on the stove, and ate some granola before packing light for a short hike around the lake. The trail was narrow and rugged, winding through thick underbrush and over small ridges. As I walked, I noticed fresh animal tracks, deer, maybe a bear, and signs of wildlife everywhere. The forest was alive, but peaceful. By mid-afternoon, the weather started to change. Clouds rolled in quickly, thick and gray, blotting out the sun. I headed back to camp to prepare. I double-checked my tent stakes and gathered more wood in case the rain came hard. As predicted, the rain began late that afternoon, light at first, then steadily increasing to a steady downpour. I spent most of the evening inside the tent, reading the map by flashlight and listening to the rain drum on the tent's fabric. That night, I was woken by the sound of something large crashing through the forest nearby. Branches snapping, heavy footsteps pounding on the ground. My heart jumped. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out through the tent's mesh window, shining the light into the trees. The rain blurred the beam, but I could just make out movement. Something big, moving fast, heading roughly toward my camp. I sat frozen, trying to stay quiet and not make a sound. After a few minutes, the noise faded away into the distance. I don't know what it was. Maybe a bear or a big moose. I stayed alert but told myself I was safe. The tent was secure, and I had the knife. The next morning, I woke to an eerie stillness. The rain had stopped, but the forest felt different, heavier somehow. When I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My carefully gathered firewood was scattered everywhere, some broken sticks crushed underfoot. More disturbingly, I noticed fresh, large animal tracks circling my camp. Tracks that definitely didn't belong to a deer or a moose. They were wide, clawed, and looked recent. I quickly packed up, not wanting to stick around longer than necessary. I decided to hike back early, choosing a slightly different route I'd marked on the map. The forest was dense and quiet, with occasional bird calls, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me, nagging at the back of my mind. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. About halfway back to the trailhead, I made a mistake. I slipped on a wet rock near a stream and twisted my ankle badly. The pain was sharp and immediate, and I couldn't put weight on my foot. Sitting there, I realized I was far from help, alone with a sprained ankle and no cell service. I pulled out my first aid kit and did my best to wrap the ankle with a compression bandage. I rested a while, trying to calm down. The forest around me was thick, the canopy filtering the sunlight into green shadows. I had to move. Staying put was dangerous. I decided to try hopping on one foot toward the trailhead, taking it slow and careful. It was exhausting. Every step hurt like hell, but I kept going, motivated by the thought of safety and warmth. The day wore on, the sun dropping lower behind the trees. As I moved, I heard the occasional distant sound. A bird call, the rustle of leaves, but also something else. A low growl, faint but definitely not an animal I wanted to meet. My pace quickened, adrenaline helping me ignore the pain. I knew bears lived in the area, and the growl sounded like one. Panic started to creep in. I looked for a sturdy branch to use as a walking stick and weapon. The sky darkened with thick clouds, and just as the first drops of rain began, I spotted a worn-down dirt road through the trees, the same one I had taken to get here. With the last of my strength, I limped toward it, hoping to find a car or someone. Then, from the bushes nearby, a large shape moved quickly. It was a bear, a massive black bear, charging toward me. My heart slammed in my chest. I froze for a second, then remembered the advice I'd read. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Back away slowly. But with a twisted ankle, slow was the best I could do. I raised my arms and shouted as loud as I could, hoping to scare it off. The bear hesitated, growled, and then retreated into the forest. I stood shaking, realizing how close I'd come to real danger. Finally, I reached the road, limping toward the trailhead where a ranger station was marked on the map. Just as the light was fading, I saw headlights. A park ranger pulled over and helped me into the vehicle, taking me back to the main road and calling for an ambulance. At the hospital, the doctor confirmed a bad sprain but no broken bones. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I thought about my trip, how beautiful and peaceful the forest was, but also how quickly it could turn dangerous and unforgiving. After that experience, I never went camping alone again. I learned that the wilderness demands respect, preparation, and caution. It's not a place for bravado or overconfidence. But I also felt proud that I'd survived and managed on my own, even when things went wrong. The forest stayed with me long after. Its smells, sounds, and the memory of that quiet lake called Moonwater. That trip taught me something important about myself, about facing fear and knowing when to push forward and when to turn back. It was the summer of 2012, early August, when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the Alageney National Forest in Pennsylvania. I was 27 years old, had spent most of my life in Pittsburgh, and craved the kind of solitude that only the woods could offer. I wasn't new to camping. I'd been on a few weekend trips with friends growing up, but this was the first time I'd planned to go alone. I had my old, reliable tent, a sleeping bag, some canned food, a small camping stove, and enough water to last a few days. I wanted to disconnect, clear my head, and challenge myself. I thought the forest would give me that. I arrived at the forest late morning, after a 3-hour drive from the city. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavy. The forest was dense, with towering oaks and maples that blocked most of the sunlight. The canopy was a thick, unbroken green ceiling. I parked at a small trailhead that I'd read about online, off the beaten path, rarely used. I loaded my backpack and set off on foot, feeling the crunch of dried leaves and twigs beneath my boots. The trail was narrow, winding through thick underbrush. Birds chirped somewhere high above, and the occasional rustle of small animals darting through the brush kept me alert. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches, moss, and the occasional mushroom. I was careful to stay on the trail, knowing that even a short detour could leave me lost. I had a map and a compass, but I wanted to trust my instincts to really get immersed. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a small clearing beside a slow-moving creek. The ground was soft and mossy, perfect for setting up camp. The creek water was clear, trickling quietly over smooth stones. I unpacked my gear and pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to hear the water but far enough to avoid the dampness. The sun was still high but starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows. I built a small fire pit with some rocks and gathered dry wood from nearby fallen branches. Starting a fire was always calming. There's something meditative about the first spark catching on the kindling, the slow flame growing into a steady fire. I cooked some canned beans over the stove and ate quietly, listening to the forest sounds. The only light came from the fire and the fading sky. As night fell, the forest became alive with different sounds. Crickets chirped, owls hooted far away, and the occasional snap of a twig echoed in the darkness. The air cooled quickly, and I zipped up my sleeping bag inside the tent. The canopy blocked out the moonlight, so it was pitch black outside. That first night, I slept well enough. I wasn't nervous. I told myself many times that the forest was just trees and animals, nothing more. But in the back of my mind, I was aware of how alone I was. No cell service, no nearby roads, no other people for miles. Just me and the wilderness. The next morning, I woke early, feeling refreshed. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside to the soft light of dawn filtering through the leaves. The creek sparkled, and the air smelled fresh and damp. I brewed some coffee on the stove and ate a granola bar while watching the forest come to life. I planned to hike deeper into the woods later in the day, so I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, and my camera. As I started down the trail, I noticed the forest felt quieter than before. The birds were fewer, and the usual sounds of small animals seemed muted. I shrugged it off as natural variance. The trail grew rougher, less maintained, with more fallen branches and rocks. I stopped a few times to take photos of wildflowers and the creek running alongside the path. After about an hour, I reached a small ridge that offered a view over the valley below. The sight was stunning. Rolling hills covered in thick trees, a patchwork of green shades stretching to the horizon. I sat on a rock to catch my breath and take it all in. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and bringing a cool breeze. As I prepared to continue, I heard something, a faint crack, like a twig snapping behind me. I turned quickly but saw nothing. The forest was dense. It was easy to miss small movements. I told myself it was probably a squirrel or a bird. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I moved forward cautiously, staying alert. The trail was barely visible now, almost swallowed by overgrown bushes. I thought about turning back, but a stubborn part of me wanted to see where it led. The map showed a small abandoned logging camp a few miles ahead, a place I'd read about but never visited. About 30 minutes later, I reached the edge of a clearing. What was left of the logging camp was sparse. Rotten wood frames, rusted metal scraps, and a collapsed shack covered in vines. The ground was littered with broken tools and old cans. It was silent, except for the wind whispering through the dead wood. I explored carefully, feeling the weight of history in the air. This place had been alive once, but now it was forgotten. As I bent down to examine a rusted axe head, I heard another noise, a low, dragging sound coming from the trees behind me. It was slow, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I froze. The noise stopped. I glanced around, heart pounding. No sign of movement. The forest felt suddenly oppressive, like the air was thicker. I decided to leave quickly. I packed up my gear and started back toward my camp, taking a more direct route to avoid the overgrown trail. The sun was lower now, and shadows stretched long. The dragging sound had me on edge, but I told myself it was probably some animal. Maybe a deer caught in brush or a fallen branch moving in the wind. Halfway back, I noticed something odd on the ground. Footprints. Not animal prints, but human footprints, fresh and large. They led deeper into the forest, away from my camp. I stared at them, confused. I hadn't seen any other hikers or campers. The area was supposed to be remote. I debated whether to follow the prints or ignore them. Curiosity won. I followed the trail carefully, keeping my eyes on the ground. The prints were spaced wide apart, like someone walking with a purpose. The forest grew denser here, the light dimmer. After about 15 minutes, I heard voices, low murmurs, too faint to understand. I stopped, heart racing. I was alone out here. Why were there voices? I crouched behind a tree and peered through the underbrush. What I saw made my stomach turn. A group of men, at least 4 or 5, gathered around a small fire. They were rough-looking, dirty, wearing old clothes and heavy boots. One was holding what looked like a metal pipe. They were talking quietly but with an edge of tension. I didn't want to be seen. I slowly backed away, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest was thick, and I tripped over a root, making a loud snap. The men froze. One looked directly toward my direction. Panic hit me like a wave. I ran, pushing through bushes and undergrowth, the men shouting behind me. Branches scratched my face and arms, and my lungs burned. I didn't know where I was going, just away from the voices. After what felt like forever, I stumbled onto the main trail near my camp. I didn't stop running until I reached my tent, fumbling with the zipper to get inside. I locked the flap, my heart hammering in my chest. The men's voices faded into the distance as they moved away from the clearing. I sat in the tent, shaking, trying to calm down. I realized I was lucky to have gotten back when I did. The area I'd wandered into was clearly dangerous. Not just abandoned, but possibly used for something illegal. I didn't want to think about what I might have stumbled upon. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside my tent made me jump. I kept my small knife close at hand and stayed as quiet as possible. The fire had burned down to embers hours ago. I waited for dawn. The next morning, I packed everything quickly. I didn't want to spend another night in that forest. I hiked out the way I came, checking behind me often. The forest seemed less threatening in the daylight, but I still felt a sharp edge of fear and unease. When I finally reached my car, relief flooded me. I locked the doors and sat for a long moment, catching my breath. The woods had been beautiful, peaceful in places, but I realized some parts of the wild weren't just about nature and solitude. People could be dangerous too. I left the Alageney forest that day with a new respect for the wild and for the unknown things that hide in the shadows, not supernatural or mythical, but human. It reminded me that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we don't expect, the real dangers that walk on two legs. Since that trip, I never camped alone again. I stick to popular sites and let someone know exactly where I am. The woods can still call me back, but now I'm careful. I carry a phone with GPS, and I trust my gut more than ever. The forest taught me something important. Survival isn't just about avoiding the wild animals or the weather. Sometimes it's about recognizing when the danger comes from within your own species and knowing when to run. I went camping alone in 2019, late September, just outside a place called Black Hill Reserve in western Montana. I was 32 back then, working as a maintenance guy at a manufacturing plant in Missoula. I'd been needing a break from everything. My job, my phone, and all the city noise. I liked going off into quiet places sometimes. Just me and the woods. I didn't go totally off-grid or anything, but I liked spots where I didn't have to deal with people for a few days. This place, Black Hill Reserve, was about 3 hours from my apartment. It wasn't a super popular spot. Not many trails, no tourist signs, and no big campgrounds with designated plots. That was perfect for me. I had found it while looking through some old forums for quiet camping spots people didn't usually go to. It wasn't exactly a secret, but it definitely wasn't crowded either. I checked the weather for the week, clear, highs in the 60s, lows in the 40s. Just right for hiking and sleeping in a tent. I packed my stuff over 2 days. A tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, a hatchet, a bunch of food, water purification tablets, and my .38 revolver, which I always brought when I camped alone. Not for animals, well, sometimes for animals, but more for peace of mind. I left early on a Thursday morning, around 5:30 a.m. The roads were mostly empty. I got there a little after 8 o'clock and parked in a gravel turnout about a mile from the forest entrance. It wasn't an official lot or anything, just a spot you'd probably miss unless you were looking for it. From there, I hiked in with my pack. I followed a rough animal path into the trees, which led to an open meadow surrounded by thick forest on 3 sides. That's where I set up camp. It was a wide, flat spot with some tall grass and soft ground. About 30 yards away was a shallow creek with clear running water, and there was a small, half-dead pine tree where I hung my trash bag to keep animals away. Felt right, private, still and quiet, just the way I wanted it. That first day was uneventful. I got everything set up by noon, had lunch, and took a nap in the sun. I walked around a bit later that afternoon, just following the creek upstream and looking at tracks in the mud. Deer mostly, and maybe a fox or coyote. I didn't see any bear sign, which was good. I made a small fire that night, nothing big. I always keep it low and neat. I cooked some can stew, read a paperback for a while, then crawled into my tent around 9:30. The sky was clear, full of stars, and the air had that cool, sharp edge you only get in the fall. I fell asleep easily. I always sleep well in the woods, but something woke me up around 3 a.m. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like a pressure shift or a gut feeling. I lay still for a while, listening. The woods were dead quiet. No crickets, no wind, nothing. That didn't happen often, but it wasn't unheard of. Still, it put me on edge. I reached over and unzipped the side of the tent just a little, poking my head out. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of the meadow. Nothing looked out of place. I stayed like that for a few minutes, then ducked back in and went back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The trash bag I had tied up on the pine branch was on the ground. Not torn or scattered, just lying there under the branch like it had been untied and dropped gently. That didn't make sense. I always double knotted it. Even a raccoon would have left a mess if it got into it. But there were no claw marks or holes, just the bag sitting there full. I felt weird about it. Not scared, more like confused. Maybe the knot slipped somehow. I hung it back up, this time looping it twice and yanking it hard to make sure it held. I didn't think too much more about it. The second day, I hiked farther up along the creek, cutting through some thick brush until I reached a small ridgeline. From the top, I could see miles of forest in every direction. No cabins, no people, no roads. That was the feeling I wanted, being nowhere. I stayed up there for a while, then headed back around mid-afternoon. When I returned to camp, I immediately noticed something was off. My folding chair, the one I'd left next to the fire pit, was lying on its side about 6 feet away. It wasn't windy. I hadn't left it like that. And next to it, in the dirt, were a few scuff marks. Not prints, not clearly, but like someone had walked or shuffled around there. I walked the area slowly, trying to find clearer tracks, but it was dry and didn't hold much shape. I checked my tent. Everything was still zipped. My bag was inside, untouched. Food was still there. Nothing was stolen. I started thinking maybe an animal had bumped into the chair, maybe a deer, but that didn't feel right either. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat inside my tent with the lantern off and just listened to the dark. Around 11 p.m., I heard something heavy move through the brush about 50 yards away. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. Step, step, pause, step, then silence again. I held my breath for a long time, gripping the revolver with both hands. I didn't hear anything else that night. In the morning, I found new marks. A deep scrape across the dirt near where I had sat the night before, like someone had dragged something, maybe a stick or maybe a boot, but it led nowhere. Just a single dragging line, then it stopped. I followed it a few feet before it disappeared into the harder ground. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but my stomach was tight. I decided I'd pack up the next day. I still had food and supplies, but the feeling of being watched had gotten too strong to ignore. That day, I stayed close to camp. I sharpened my hatchet, gathered some firewood, and tried to make enough noise that anything nearby would know I was around. I whistled occasionally, not out of cheer, but to break the silence. It didn't help. I had that feeling again, the one where your skin feels too tight and your ears pick up things you're not sure you're really hearing. Twigs snapping far off. A rustle when there's no wind. That night, the sounds came back, this time closer. At one point, just before midnight, I swear I heard breathing. Not animal breathing, slow, controlled, quiet. It was right outside my tent, maybe 2 feet away. I didn't move. I held my breath, my hand wrapped around the grip of the revolver. I waited like that for what felt like hours. Then it faded. No footsteps, no retreat, just gone. I barely slept. At dawn, I unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly, revolver still in hand. The grass around my tent had been pressed down, like someone had walked in a circle around it. I looked at the trash bag, it was gone. Not torn down, not on the ground, just gone. That's when I knew I had to leave now. I packed everything in under 15 minutes, throwing it into my pack any way I could. I doused the fire pit, slung the pack on, and started heading back toward the road. I didn't take the trail. I cut through the woods in a straight line using my compass and memory. I moved fast, constantly turning to look behind me. I didn't see anyone, not once, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me the whole way. When I got back to the road and saw my car, I almost cried. I threw the pack in the back seat and peeled out of there without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit cell service again. That night, back in my apartment, I left the lights on and double-locked the door. I kept the gun within reach. A week later, I went online and started digging through forums again, this time looking for anything strange around Black Hill Reserve. I didn't find much. No news stories, no crime reports. But on one old forum thread from 2012, a guy mentioned something weird. He said he'd camped near the creek and woke up to find someone had taken his boots in the night. Just the boots. He said he packed up and never went back. Another guy replied saying he thought it was a local weirdo who lived somewhere in the woods, not officially on any map. Said he didn't bother people directly, just messed with their stuff. Quiet, subtle things. No confrontations. No violence. Just signs. Just presence. That stuck with me. I still think about it now and then, especially when I see trees moving in ways they shouldn't, or hear a step behind me in a quiet place. I haven't been back to Black Hill since. I haven't camped alone either. I still go out sometimes, but only to public sites with people nearby. It's not the same. I miss that feeling of total silence and peace. But it's not worth it. Not if someone's out there watching. Not if they don't want you there. I was lucky. I think whoever it was just wanted to remind me I wasn't alone. That was enough for me. I went camping alone in the mountains of northern Vermont back in late September of 2017. I was 32 at the time, and I just quit my job in Boston after working there nearly a decade. I didn't hate it, but it had worn me down. I needed time away from everything. No phones, no cars, no people. Just air and space and silence. I packed up my SUV with a new tent, a proper sleeping pad, enough food and water for a few days, and a good camping knife. I didn't have much experience camping alone, but I'd done a few weekends here and there over the years. This was the first time I was doing it completely solo and off-trail. I'd found this spot during a hike the year before with an old friend. It was about 4 miles off the marked trails in Green Mountain National Forest. There was a slight incline, and then it flattened out into this long, mossy stretch next to a cold, clear stream. The place felt hidden, surrounded by birches and tall pines, far enough from the trail that you couldn't hear anything but wind and birds. I remembered how quiet it had been. I wanted that again. I left my car in the small gravel lot around 9 a.m., strapped my pack tight, and started the hike. The weather was good, around 60 degrees, sky clear. I had checked the forecast a few times before heading out. No rain, not too cold, and barely any wind. Ideal conditions. The hike in was slower than I'd hoped. I wasn't used to carrying that much gear, and a few times I had to stop and rest. It was almost 1 p.m. by the time I reached the spot. The stream still ran cold and clean. I bent down and splashed my face in it before unpacking. I set up the tent on the driest, flattest patch I could find, about 30 feet from the water. I cleared out sharp twigs and rocks from under the tarp, set up the rainfly, and staked it all down tight. Then I got out the small folding chair, the bare canister with food, and a small bundle of firewood I'd strapped to the outside of my pack. I collected more dry sticks nearby, enough for the next 2 nights, and built a little ring with rocks to keep the fire contained. I felt proud of myself. That first evening was quiet, peaceful. I made a small fire around sunset and boiled water for a freeze-dried chicken and rice meal. After that, I sat by the fire with a headlamp and read a paperback until I got tired. I remember the sounds clearly: wind nudging the trees, a few birds chirping, the stream whispering nearby. It was cold when I zipped up inside my sleeping bag, but not unbearable. I fell asleep without trouble. The second day was more or less the same. I walked around a bit after breakfast, wandered through the trees, followed the stream for a few hundred yards in each direction. I found some deer tracks near the water. I saw a fox in the distance. I kept my food hung from a branch away from camp. No bear sightings, thankfully. The afternoon passed quietly. I made another fire that evening, had another meal, and again read until I got tired. That night, though, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just different. a kind of soft crackling sound, maybe 30 or 40 feet from my tent. I lay still, listening. Then I heard another snap, like a stick breaking. Could have been an animal. Probably was. A deer, maybe. But my heart was pounding like crazy. I stayed still, not making a sound, not turning on my headlamp. After a while, it stopped. I didn't hear anything else. I fell back asleep eventually, but not easily. The next morning, I went to check the area where I thought the sound came from. There were a few broken sticks, some pressed down leaves. Could have been anything. No footprints, at least none that I could recognize. I brushed it off. Animals live here too, after all. That's the whole point of being out there. Still, I kept my knife on me all day, just in case. That day, I didn't do much. I mostly stayed near camp. I gathered more firewood, refilled my water bottles from the stream using the purifier, tried to fish a little but didn't catch anything. I had enough food anyway. I spent most of the afternoon just sitting and listening, soaking it in. It felt like the kind of silence I'd needed for years. That night, after I finished eating and put out the fire, I got into the tent around 9 p.m. I was more on edge than the night before, listening again for anything out of place. I must have fallen asleep around 10. I woke up to the sound of something tapping. Not a knock, not scratching. A slow, irregular tapping noise. At first I thought it was rain, but when I opened my eyes and listened, I knew it wasn't that. It was too sharp. It sounded like something lightly hitting the side of my tent. Just one tap, pause, then another. It happened 3 or 4 times. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart raced in my chest so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I reached slowly to my side where the knife was. I held it tightly and stayed completely still. Another sound came, this time a footstep. Just one. Then nothing. It had been almost completely silent before. That one step stood out. I thought about unzipping the flap and shining the light, but I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I lay there for maybe half an hour, barely blinking. Nothing else happened. Eventually, when I couldn't take it anymore, I slowly unzipped the sleeping bag, crawled forward, and peered through the mesh at the front of the tent. My headlamp was on, but I kept it covered with my hand to dim it. I didn't see anything outside. I waited another 10 minutes before slowly unzipping the tent and stepping out. It was cold. My breath came out in fog. I looked around the campsite. Nothing moved. The fire pit was dead. The food bag still hanging. No branches broken or fresh tracks. I walked in a slow circle, scanning everything, every tree, every shadow. Still nothing. I stood there for a while, not breathing, not moving. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the tent, knife in hand, until the sky turned gray. The next morning, I didn't pack up right away. I walked the perimeter again, checked all around the camp. Still no signs. I told myself I was just being jumpy, sleep deprived. Maybe I had imagined the tapping sound. Maybe a small branch fell or something brushed the tent in the wind. Maybe that footstep was an animal. But it didn't feel that way. Still, I stayed. I had planned for one more night. I didn't want to talk myself out of it. I thought I'd regret cutting the trip short just because I got spooked. I kept the fire going most of that afternoon and into the evening. It felt safer with it burning. When it got dark, I stayed outside the tent longer than usual, poking the fire, listening hard. I didn't eat much that night. My stomach was tight. I waited until around 11 p.m. before getting into the tent. I left my boots by the entrance, knife next to me, headlamp in my hand, jacket still on. I lay there wide awake. I don't know what time it was when I heard the sound. Not tapping this time. Footsteps. 2 or 3. Not close but not far either. Moving slowly. Then a pause. Then another few steps. I sat up and turned on the headlamp. The beam cut through the mesh, lighting the trees in front of the tent. I couldn't see anything, but the footsteps were still there, still moving, slowly. Then they stopped. I turned off the light, sat frozen. I heard nothing for maybe 10 minutes. Then something else, a low metallic sound. Faint, far off, like metal clinking, just once. I couldn't tell where it came from. I felt my scalp go tight. At that point, something shifted in me. I didn't want to be out there anymore. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It wasn't quiet in a good way. I was being watched. I was sure of it. I stayed up the entire night, knife in one hand, light in the other, waiting. When the sun rose, I got out of the tent and started tearing it down right away. I packed as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just broke down everything and stuffed it in my bag. I didn't check the area like I had before. I didn't look around. I just left. The hike back took me almost 2 hours less than the hike in. I barely stopped. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening. The woods didn't feel the same. I didn't feel alone. When I reached the parking lot and saw my car still there, I felt a wave of relief. I threw everything in the back and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. I sat there for a while before starting the engine, just sitting, holding the steering wheel, trying to understand what had happened, trying to make sense of it. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while, not because I thought they'd laugh, but because I didn't know how to explain it. There was no ghost, no monster, just sounds. Small signs, but whatever or whoever it was, it had waited until the third night to really start moving. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through some hiking forums and came across a thread about unsettling things people had experienced while camping. One person mentioned finding what looked like small campsites deep in the woods with no sign of recent use but strange things. Knives stuck in trees, bits of old rope, burned cans. Another mentioned hearing footsteps around their I took that camping trip in late August of 2017. I was 29 at the time, working long hours as a mechanic in a small auto shop just outside of Kansas City. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and barely had the energy to see friends more than once a week. Everything just started to feel like a loop: work, sleep, repeat. So when I finally got a few days off, I figured I'd do something I hadn't done since I was a teenager: go camping alone. I didn't have any big plan. I just wanted quiet. I wanted to go somewhere far enough from the city that I wouldn't hear traffic or phones ringing or people yelling over engines. I pulled out an old map I had in the bottom drawer of my closet, looked for something remote but still reachable by truck, and found a spot in western Missouri, near a place called Dry Hollow. It wasn't even marked as a real campground. Just a few dotted trails that led through the woods and into some clearings that looked open enough for setting up a tent. I packed light but smart. I had my old canvas tent, a propane burner, a fold-up chair, a big cooler with enough food and water for 4 days, and a hunting knife I always kept in the glove box, even though I didn't hunt. I took a basic map, a compass, and my phone with a car charger, though I figured I'd lose signal out there. I also threw in a small first aid kit, a headlamp, and a heavy-duty flashlight. I left my truck around noon on a Wednesday, hiked in about 2 hours, and found a flat patch of grass near a creek. It was quiet, peaceful. The air smelled like wet pine and dirt, and there wasn't a single piece of trash or boot print that I could see. I figured I'd picked the perfect place. The first day was uneventful. I set up camp, gathered some dry sticks for the fire, and spent a while just sitting in the chair, listening. No voices, no motors, no planes overhead. Just the wind, birds, and now and then the sound of water shifting around stones in the creek. That night, I ate a can of beans and some jerky, then sat by the fire until the sky went dark and the crickets got louder. I fell asleep faster than I expected. The ground was hard, but the air was cool, and I didn't even wake up once. The second day, I did some exploring. I followed the creek about half a mile north, just seeing where it went. It wound through a tighter patch of trees, then flattened out again into a small pool surrounded by tall grass. Looked like deer came there often. There were hoof marks in the mud and some droppings nearby. I didn't bring my fishing gear, but I saw a few small trout flickering under the surface. I sat there a while, boots off, soaking my feet in the cold water, thinking about nothing. Felt good. Later that afternoon, I walked the other direction and marked a few trees with shallow cuts so I wouldn't get turned around. I didn't go far, maybe half a mile in each direction, but I felt more comfortable knowing the area. It wasn't until the third night that I started to feel uneasy. Nothing happened during the day. I spent most of it lying in the sun near the creek and watching a pair of hawks circling high above the ridge. But around sunset, I noticed something off. The forest got quiet, too quiet. Birds that had been calling back and forth all day just stopped. I didn't hear frogs near the creek or squirrels moving in the brush. The silence didn't seem natural. I figured maybe a coyote or something had wandered through the area, so I kept my knife close just in case. But I didn't hear any footsteps. No snapping branches. Just stillness. I tried not to let it get to me. I made a fire, cooked a quick dinner, and tried to shake it off. But my ears kept straining, waiting for a sound. Any sound. By the time I got into the tent, I was wired. My eyes were wide open even though I was exhausted, and I kept imagining I was hearing things outside. I told myself it was just the woods playing tricks. You spend enough time in total silence, your brain fills in the gaps. Still, I barely slept that night. I'd drift off for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, then wake up covered in sweat, heart racing. Sure, I'd heard something just outside the tent. Around 3 a.m., I finally got up, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and stepped outside barefoot. I stood by the fire pit just listening. There was no wind, no crickets, nothing. I scanned the trees with the flashlight, and everything looked normal. Nothing moved, nothing shined back, but I still had this feeling, like I wasn't alone. I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, but something was off. I sat by the cold ashes of the fire for maybe an hour, gripping the knife, waiting. Eventually, I got back in the tent and stayed awake until the sky turned light. The next morning, I told myself I was being stupid. I packed some food into my day pack and told myself I'd do a longer hike. Shake the nerves off. I followed a narrow game trail west, deeper into the woods, planning to make a loop and come back around from the south. I marked trees with shallow cuts again and kept track of the sun. I walked about 2 hours, slowly, and didn't see anything strange. No people, no trash, just trees, underbrush, and a lot of steep ridges. Then, near the bottom of a rocky slope, I saw something that made me stop cold. It was a footprint, a bare one. It looked fresh, still had clear edges. No shoes. It was long, narrow, and slightly angled like someone had slid down the slope. I looked around and didn't see any others, but the dirt was hard and dry in most places. Still, there was something about it. I looked at my own boot, compared the size. Whoever it was, they were maybe my height, maybe taller. I felt that sick feeling again, like I was being watched. The air was warm, but my arms had goosebumps. I turned around and went back the way I came, faster this time, eyes scanning every tree. I kept hearing little things, twigs snapping, rustling leaves, but never saw anyone. I got back to camp and stayed near it the rest of the day. I didn't make a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food, stayed in the tent, and kept the knife and flashlight in my hands the entire time. That night, I barely slept again. Around midnight, I heard a single crunch of leaves. Not an animal. Too heavy, too slow. I stayed frozen in the tent, not even breathing. After a few minutes, it stopped. Nothing else followed. I sat there, completely still, until the sky started to brighten. The first light, I packed everything. Tent, cooler, stove, all of it. I stuffed it into the pack and didn't even care if things fit right. I just wanted to get out. I followed the creek south, the fastest way I knew back to where I parked the truck. I didn't stop for water. I didn't stop to rest. I just walked, knife in hand, ears straining. The whole forest still felt too quiet. Then, about a mile from where I'd left the truck, I saw it. A tree maybe 10 feet off the path with a piece of string tied around it. Not rope, string. Dirty, frayed, and tied in a loop, like a snare. And on the ground beneath it, I saw a torn piece of cloth. Dark green, faded, looked like the kind used for tents or jackets. I didn't touch it. I didn't even step off the path. I just kept walking, faster. I got back to the truck around mid-morning. Everything was exactly as I left it. Doors locked, tires fine. I threw the gear into the bed without organizing it and got in, locked the doors, and drove until I hit a main road. I didn't stop until I got to a gas station about an hour away. When I finally had a signal again, I checked the news. Nothing. No missing person reports. No alerts. Nothing out of the ordinary in that area. I thought about reporting it, but what would I even say? I saw a footprint, a piece of cloth. I hadn't seen a person, hadn't heard a voice. It would sound like paranoia, but I know what I felt out there. I know I wasn't alone. Someone had been moving through those woods barefoot. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who was probably watching me for longer than I realized. I never went camping alone again. I still go outdoors sometimes, but only in designated parks, only with friends, and only where there are rangers nearby. I still have that same knife, but I keep it sharper now. And when I think back on that trip, I don't remember the peaceful part. I remember the silence, the footprint, the feeling of being watched. And I remember how lucky I was to leave without ever seeing who or what was out there. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the hills north of Wanachi, Washington. It was August 2021, and after working 12-hour shifts for weeks at the warehouse, I needed a break from the constant sound of forklifts, people yelling over radios, and fluorescent lights that gave everything a sick green glow. I wanted to be completely alone. No emails, no noise, no lights, just trees and silence. I chose a place I'd heard about from an old hiking forum. It wasn't an official trail or a designated campground. Someone had marked it on a map and uploaded a few blurry pictures. Pine trees, a flat patch of dirt, a stream running nearby. No reviews, no other mentions of it. Just one post titled, "Great if you want quiet." That was enough for me. I packed my gear the night before I left. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, freeze-dried food, extra batteries, headlamp, a small hatchet, and a bear canister. I triple-checked everything. Even brought a paper map in case my GPS died. I printed out the directions from the forum, which were written in a sloppy paragraph of vague instructions. Turn off Highway 2 at the Fire Road after mile marker 78. Follow it until it forks, go left, then park when you reach the deadfall blocking the road. From there, hike northeast for about 2 miles until you reach a stream. Camp spots near that. The next morning, I left at dawn. I lived about 4 hours from that area, and I wanted to get there early enough to set up while it was still light. The drive was easy, mostly empty roads and blue skies. I stopped for gas and filled my water containers at a rest area. By the time I reached mile marker 78, I was already feeling lighter. The fire road was barely visible, just 2 ruts in the grass that disappeared into the trees. I turned in and crawled along in my old Jeep, tires crunching over rocks and dry branches. It was slow going. I kept the windows down. The air smelled like hot pine needles. The deadfall blocking the road came up about 20 minutes later. A huge tree, probably downed in a storm. I backed the Jeep into a little clearing, locked everything up, and threw on my pack. I checked my compass and started walking northeast. The hike was rough. There wasn't a trail, just uneven ground covered in brambles and fallen limbs. The heat wasn't bad, but the bugs were. I kept smacking at my neck and arms as I pushed through the undergrowth. Every now and then I'd stop and listen, just to be sure I wasn't circling back or drifting off course. I heard nothing but wind in the trees and the distant pecking of a woodpecker. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, I heard the stream. It was faint at first, a soft trickling that got louder the farther I walked. Then I saw it, narrow, maybe 4 feet across, clear water running over smooth stones. The ground flattened out nearby, a perfect patch of dry earth surrounded by ferns. It looked exactly like the photo. I dropped my pack and stood there for a moment, sweating and breathing heavy, but smiling. I set up my tent near a large boulder and unpacked my gear. I kept the food sealed in the bear canister and wedged it between 2 rocks under some shade. I boiled water and ate a bag of instant rice and beans while sitting on the boulder, staring at the stream. Everything felt still. I hadn't seen a single person or car or even a plane since I left the fire road. That was what I came for. As the sun dropped, I gathered some dry twigs and branches and made a small fire ring with rocks. I didn't need a big fire, just something to sit by for a bit. The flames kept the bugs away, and I watched sparks float into the dark like fireflies. After the fire died down, I crawled into my tent and zipped up the door. I lay there for a while, listening to the wind move through the branches overhead. I fell asleep easily. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something cracked outside, twigs snapping. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. I didn't hear anything else for a while. I stayed still, eyes open, listening. Then I heard it again, a crunch like a boot stepping on leaves. It wasn't close, but it was deliberate. I reached for my headlamp and slowly turned it on. The red light dim. I didn't unzip the tent. I just listened. After a few minutes, nothing more came. No more steps. I finally told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear just passing through. I had the bear can far enough from the tent. I waited another 10 minutes, then shut off the light and tried to go back to sleep. Took a while. The next morning, the forest looked calm again. No footprints, no overturned rocks or signs that anything had been through. I walked a wide loop around the camp but didn't see anything strange. That put me at ease. I made coffee on the little stove and sat with my feet in the stream for most of the morning. Around midday, I hiked farther upstream, following it for about a mile just to see where it went. It narrowed and passed between two ridges. I didn't want to get too far without marking the way back, so I stopped when the terrain started to climb sharply. I turned around and followed my markers back. By the time I returned, the sun was starting to dip. I boiled water for another meal and sat by the fire again. That night, I stayed up longer, watching the sky go black and the stars come out. There were no clouds, no light pollution. I hadn't seen stars like that in years. I eventually crawled into the tent and fell asleep without trouble. But I woke up again around 2 a.m. This time, it wasn't a sound that woke me. It was a feeling. I sat up, heart thumping. It was dead quiet outside. Not even wind. I didn't move for a while. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, careful. Not far from the tent. I turned on the red light again and leaned close to the fabric, listening. They were moving in a circle around my tent. I froze. It was too quiet for an animal. There was no snorting or rustling, just footsteps. They moved for a minute or two, then stopped. I held my breath. I didn't dare unzip the door. My knife was in my bag outside, near the fire pit. I only had a hatchet inside the tent. I stayed completely still. After what felt like 10 minutes, I heard them again, moving away this time. Not running, just walking, then silence. I didn't sleep again that night. I just sat in my sleeping bag, holding the hatchet, staring at the ceiling of the tent until the sky started to turn pale gray. When the light was strong enough, I unzipped the door and stepped outside. The air was cold, and everything looked the same, but I noticed a spot near the edge of the clearing where the grass had been flattened. I walked over and looked closer. There were impressions in the dirt, heel marks, boots, human boots. I looked in every direction. Nothing moved in the trees. I felt my hands start to shake. I didn't want to overreact, but someone had walked through my camp in the middle of the night. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing. The bear canister was still wedged where I left it, and my food was untouched. The fire ring hadn't been disturbed. I thought about packing up and leaving right away, but I didn't. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter or some other camper passing through. The forest wasn't technically private land. It was just remote. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. That day, I didn't leave camp. I stayed close, listening for movement. Every time the wind moved the branches, I jumped. I kept the hatchet with me even when I used the bathroom. I didn't build a fire that night. I didn't cook. I just ate a dry protein bar, got in the tent early, and zipped up. I didn't sleep. Every sound made my skin crawl. Sometime around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. Slower this time, closer. They came right up to the tent. Then they stopped. I could hear breathing. I swear I could. Just inches away. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then I heard something being dragged over the tent. A finger, maybe, or a stick. It scraped along the fabric, slow and light. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would tear through my chest. I wanted to scream, to bolt out of the tent and run, but I stayed frozen. Then, after a few minutes, the sound stopped. The steps moved away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn came, I unzipped the door and looked around. Nothing. No one. But there was a mark on the tent. A line of dirt smeared from top to bottom like something had been dragged over it. I stood there for a long time, staring at the trees. I packed everything in record time. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just crammed all my gear into the bag and started hiking back toward the fire road. I checked over my shoulder every few minutes, certain I'd see someone following me. But I didn't. When I reached the Jeep, everything was still there, untouched. I climbed in, locked the doors, and drove as fast as I could until I reached the main road. I didn't stop until I hit the first town an hour away. I pulled into a diner parking lot and just sat there for a long time. I never went back to that spot. I deleted the post I found it from and threw away the printout. I still camp sometimes, but only in designated places where I know other I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone out in the wilderness. I'd been doing shorter trips for a few years, mostly weekend hikes or 3-day campouts, but never something that lasted more than a few nights and never completely solo. The idea had been eating at me for a while. I wanted the isolation, the silence, the challenge. I wanted to know what it was like to wake up with no phone signal, no noise but the wind and the animals, and nobody to fall back on if something went wrong. I planned it carefully over a few months. I picked a state forest in southern Oregon, a place called Redwater State Preserve. It wasn't one of the big national parks, and that's what I liked about it. Fewer people, fewer tourists, just miles of forest, dirt roads, and forgotten logging trails. It was August 2022, and I figured I'd go right after the worst of the summer heat. The forest was dry, but not dangerously so. Fires had been a problem earlier that summer, but they were mostly east of where I was headed. I packed heavy. I brought a bear canister even though I'd only heard of black bears being around that area, and even then not often. I had a good tent, a sleeping bag that could handle cold nights, a camp stove, and a small solar panel that could trickle charge my headlamp or GPS if needed. I carried a folding saw, a fixed blade knife, 2 lighters, and a metal fire starter. Food was mostly dehydrated stuff: beans, rice, oatmeal, jerky, trail mix. I filled a 3-liter bladder and brought iodine tablets for emergencies. I had 2 paper maps of the forest and marked out the trail I planned to hike on. My idea was simple: hike about 15 miles into the forest, far off the main access road, and find a place near a small creek I'd seen on the topo map. I'd stay there for 4 nights, then circle back using a different loop. I parked my car at a pullout near a locked gate. Beyond that, it was old Forest Service roads, mostly overgrown. I left the car on a Sunday afternoon and started hiking with about 45 pounds on my back. Took about 6 hours to reach where I wanted to be. I passed a couple small clearings and one old rusted pickup truck that looked like it had been swallowed by the woods. Trees had grown around it. I figured someone had driven in years ago before the roads were closed off and just left it. By the time I found the creek, the sun was low, and I was sweating through my shirt. I followed the water upstream a few hundred yards and found a flat, pine-covered rise above the bank. That became my camp. I set up the tent under a group of Douglas firs and cleared a small area for a fire ring, though I didn't plan on lighting one the first night. That first night, I slept hard. I barely even remembered crawling into the tent. My feet ached and my legs throbbed in a way I hadn't felt since I first started backpacking years ago. I woke up with the sun around 6, opened the tent, and sat there just listening to the sound of water moving over rocks. Felt peaceful. I made oatmeal, sat against a tree, and wrote in a little notebook I brought. I had no schedule. That was the point. I walked up and down the creek a bit, fished without much luck, took a nap in the afternoon, and made a small fire that night just for the comfort of it. No sounds of people, no airplanes overhead, just the forest and the occasional rustle in the brush. I thought at the time that this was exactly what I needed. The second night was when things started to shift. It wasn't obvious, just little things. Right after sunset, when I was sitting beside the fire with my pot of beans, I heard what I thought was a branch snap on the other side of the creek. It didn't sound like a small stick, more like a thick limb cracking under pressure. I froze, listening. Sometimes animals break branches. Deer, elk, even turkeys. I told myself that, but it felt off. I didn't hear any rustling before or after, just that single crack. I stared into the woods until my eyes blurred, but nothing moved. I finished eating, cleaned up, packed everything away properly, and got into the tent early. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept waking up. I thought I heard faint movements outside the tent, like footsteps, but soft, irregular ones. At one point, I was sure I heard breathing. Not an animal grunt or sniff, just slow, low breathing, not far from the tent wall. I held my breath to listen harder, and it stopped. Could have been wind, or my imagination, or even just the trees groaning slightly in the cool night air. But it didn't feel like that. It felt closer. I laid there for a long time with my knife in hand. Eventually, I fell asleep again, but it was light, broken sleep. I woke up stiff with a slight headache and that dull, uncomfortable tightness in my chest you get when you're not sure what's real and what isn't. Day 3, I didn't go far from camp. I told myself it was because I wanted to rest, but really, I was uneasy. I kept looking over my shoulder when I gathered water, and the forest no longer felt as welcoming. I couldn't put my finger on it. Everything looked the same, but the mood had shifted. Even the birds seemed quieter. I decided I'd cut the trip short and leave the next morning. I didn't like how on edge I was, and I didn't want to stay another night with that feeling. That afternoon, I packed up most of my gear and got it ready to go. I ate early and put out the fire completely. I didn't want anything attracting attention. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I laid in my sleeping bag with my boots on, knife in hand, headlamp clipped to my chest. Around 2 a.m., I heard something moving through the brush across the creek. It was slow, deliberate. A crackle here, a pause, another step. It circled. I didn't hear hooves. No snorting, no animal sounds. Just pacing, one step at a time, staying just out of sight. I didn't move. I was scared that any sound from me would invite something in. I stared at the roof of the tent for what felt like hours. Around 4 a.m., I finally unzipped the flap and peeked outside. There was nothing there, but the forest felt like it was holding its breath. I packed up at first light. I didn't eat, didn't brush my teeth, didn't filter water. I just rolled up the tent, strapped it down, and hit the trail. I took a different route out using a fire road I'd marked on my map. It was overgrown, but I moved quickly, driven by nerves and the hope of reaching the car before dark. About 4 hours in, I noticed something strange. A footprint. Not mine. Not a boot. Barefoot. Human. It was in the soft dirt beside a tree where I had stopped to rest. I crouched and stared at it. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't been there long. Toes. Heel. Slight arch. Maybe a man's foot. Slightly larger than mine. What really unsettled me was how far I was from anything. There weren't any trailheads nearby. And who the hell walks out here barefoot? I pushed harder, sweating through my shirt even though it wasn't hot. I didn't stop to rest again. The whole time I kept thinking about that footprint, about the pacing steps outside my tent, about how I never actually saw anything, but it all felt deliberate. Watched, chased, even if it wasn't obvious. I reached the car just before sunset. I looked around the lot. No other vehicles, no rangers, just my dusty Subaru sitting exactly where I'd left it. I didn't waste time. I threw the pack in the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors before I even started the engine. When I pulled out onto the highway, I felt a wave of relief so strong I had to pull over 10 minutes later to catch my breath. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel. I didn't sleep well, but at least the walls felt solid, and there were other people nearby. The next day, I drove home. I never reported anything. Who would I tell? What would I say? That I heard branches snap and saw a footprint? That's not illegal. It's not even a story. It's just a feeling, an impression, something being off. That trip changed how I look at camping. I still go out. I still enjoy the woods, but I don't go solo anymore. Not that deep, not that far. Something was out there, maybe a squatter, Maybe someone living off-grid. Maybe someone with reasons to stay hidden. All I know is that it didn't want me there, and the way it stayed invisible made it worse. It never showed itself. It didn't have to. Just the presence was enough. I don't think it was trying to hurt me. If it wanted to, it had plenty of chances. But I think it wanted to scare me, and it worked. I got the message loud and clear. I haven't gone back to Redwater since, and I don't plan to. Some places don't want company. I was 34 the summer I decided to drive across the state and spend a long weekend in the southern mountains, near a place called Burkdale Ridge. It wasn't a popular spot, not compared to the bigger parks or campgrounds. Most people I mentioned it to hadn't even heard of it. That was exactly why I picked it. I wanted the quiet, the kind that only comes from being far from everything. I'd been working too much, stuck in a stuffy office all spring, and I needed something that didn't involve screens or schedules or people. I left early on a Thursday, before sunrise, with my truck packed with gear. I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, extra water, maps, flashlight, folding chair, food in sealed containers, a basic first aid kit, even bear spray, though I doubted I'd need it. It was a solid drive, almost 6 hours, but most of it went by fast. The roads were decent until I got into the last stretch, where the pavement ended and turned into a dirt path that twisted up into the hills. My tires kicked up dust the whole way. No one was around. It felt like I'd already left the rest of the world behind. I reached the edge of the ridge by late afternoon. There were no signs, no other cars, just a rough, flat patch of dirt at the end of the trail. Trees thick with dark green needles surrounded everything. The forest was deep, a mix of pine and fir, and it smelled sharp and earthy. I could hear nothing but wind through the branches and the distant ticking of insects. No birds, no planes, no other campers. I set up my tent at the edge of the clearing, where the slope of the ridge gave way to a view of the forest valley below. I had to hammer the stakes harder than usual because the ground was dry and rocky. Afterward, I unpacked the rest of my things, stretched out my legs, and cooked a quick dinner on the camp stove. Just some canned stew and instant rice. I ate while watching the sun drop below the hills. The sky turned orange, then purple, and finally black. I went to bed soon after. The first night was quiet. No sounds at all except for the occasional creak of the trees. I lay in my sleeping bag, headlamp clipped to the ceiling of the tent but turned off, staring at the fabric above me. I wasn't nervous. I'd camped alone before, but something about the stillness felt thicker than usual. I chalked it up to being so far from everything and eventually fell asleep. The next day I woke early. The air was cold, and condensation clung to the inside of the tent. I boiled water for coffee and oatmeal, then sat in my chair and ate while looking out over the ridge. Fog hung low in the trees below, shifting slowly with the breeze. I decided to hike part of the trail that supposedly looped down into the forest and back up along the opposite side of the ridge. It wasn't a marked trail, just something I'd seen traced faintly on an old topo map I'd picked up online. I packed a small day pack with snacks, water, a map, compass, and the essentials, then headed out. The descent was steep in places and I had to watch my footing. Fallen branches and loose rocks made the path tricky. I walked for an hour or two before stopping to rest by a stream that cut through the bottom of the valley. The water was clean and cold. I refilled my bottle with a filter and listened to the soft rush of the current. I hadn't seen or heard a single other person since I'd arrived. As I climbed the opposite side, I noticed something odd. Not scary, just strange. There was a group of fallen trees, all angled the same way, like they'd been pushed over from one direction. No signs of rot or storm damage. The trunks were snapped clean. It wasn't impossible for wind to do that, but they weren't near the ridgeline, and none of the nearby trees were affected. I took a mental note but didn't think much of it. It took most of the afternoon to make the full loop. When I got back to camp, the sun was low again. I was tired but satisfied. I made dinner, this time frying up some pre-cooked sausage and boiling noodles. I sat by the fire pit I'd built earlier that day, just a circle of rocks with twigs and small logs I'd collected nearby, and watched the flames burn low. The quiet was heavier that night. Still no animals. No hoots or howls or anything. Just before I went to sleep, I heard a sound. A single crack, like a stick snapping, from somewhere deep in the trees behind the tent. I froze for a second, listening. Nothing else followed. I stayed still longer, staring into the black trees, but it didn't come again. I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon and climbed into the tent. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, half expecting to hear something outside. Once or twice I thought I did soft footfalls maybe, but they stopped as soon as I sat up. Every time I unzipped the flap and looked out, there was nothing. I finally fell asleep again after 4 in the morning. When I woke up, it was already late. The sun was high, and the inside of the tent was warm. I got up slowly, body stiff, and walked around the clearing. Something felt different. The air wasn't just quiet. It was tense, like everything was holding its breath. I walked to the edge of the ridge and looked out. The view was the same, but when I came back toward the tent, I noticed the first real sign that something was wrong. One of my gear bags had been moved. It was just a foot or two from where I'd left it, but I knew I hadn't touched it. The zipper was undone, and some of the contents, rope, spare batteries, a sealed package of crackers, were on the ground. Nothing was taken, just disturbed. I checked around the site. No tracks, no claw marks, just that quiet, dry earth. I felt uneasy, but I stayed. I spent the day closer to camp, walking short loops, keeping the tent in sight. Every so often I stopped to listen. Once, while crouched by a tree, I thought I heard breathing very faint from the trees just beyond the clearing. Stopped as soon as I moved. I checked the area but saw nothing. That night, I didn't start a fire. I ate a cold dinner and stayed inside the tent as soon as it got dark. I lay there with the flashlight beside me and the bear spray within reach. Hours passed. Just past midnight, I heard it again. Not a stick crack this time. This time it was footsteps, light, slow, deliberate. They came from the left side of the tent, near where I'd stacked the firewood. I held my breath. The steps stopped, then started again, circling toward the back. I sat up slowly and unzipped the side pocket of the tent just enough to look out. Nothing. But then I heard it again, closer this time. And then, silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes wide in the dark, hand on the spray canister. No more sounds came, but I knew now something or someone was out there. First light, I packed. Fast. I didn't eat. I didn't stretch. I just crammed everything into the truck, double-checked nothing was left behind, and got ready to leave. But before I climbed in, I walked around the perimeter of the clearing one more time. That's when I found them. Footprints. Human ones. Barefoot. They weren't mine. I wore boots the whole time. These were narrow, long, deep in the heel like someone had been walking slowly. They circled the tent. Then they disappeared into the trees. I got in the truck and drove, not stopping until I was 20 miles away and had cell service again. I pulled into a gas station and just sat there. My heart was still racing. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? That was 2 years ago in 2023. I haven't gone back since. I still camp, but only in marked areas with other people nearby. I never figured out who it was out there. Could have been a hermit or some backwoods drifter or just someone messing with me. I don't care. What matters is I got out. I think about those footprints sometimes. The way they circled my tent. How they came without a sound. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen. They waited, watched, got close. Maybe closer than I knew. Maybe they came right up to the tent when I was asleep. Maybe they reached out and touched it. All I know for sure is I was lucky. I left before whatever was going to happen happened. I trusted my gut and got out. I never camp alone anymore. It was the spring of 1998 when I found myself alone in a small cabin deep in the remote woods of northern Vermont. I was 27 then, tired from city life and looking to get away from everything for a few days. The plan was simple. Spend a week off the grid, no distractions, just me, the forest, and a chance to clear my head. I had booked the cabin through a small local rental agency I found online. The place was called Maple Hollow, a one-room cabin nestled near the edge of a dense pine forest, close to a slow-moving creek. The owner's photos showed a simple wooden structure with a stone chimney and a small porch. It looked rustic but inviting, the kind of place where you'd expect a quiet, restful time. No electricity, no phone service, exactly what I wanted. When I arrived, late afternoon, the sun was dipping low behind the hills. The air smelled fresh, a mixture of damp earth, pine needles, and something like old wood smoke. The dirt road leading to the cabin was narrow and rutted, and my little sedan bounced over rocks and loose soil. The surrounding trees stood tall and tight, their branches weaving into a dark green ceiling. The only sounds were the chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. The wood was rough but solid. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, and the windows had thin, cracked glass. Inside, the place was small but clean. A wood stove sat in one corner, a single bed against the far wall, and a little kitchen area with a sink and some cabinets. No running water, but there was a hand pump outside near the porch. A box of firewood was stacked neatly beside the cabin. The place had a smell of old wood mixed with a faint trace of pine sap. I dropped my bags on the floor and opened the windows to let the fresh air in. The quiet was almost unnatural after the constant noise of the city. There was no hum of traffic, no distant sirens, nothing but silence and the occasional sound of the forest. I unpacked a few essentials, grabbed the matches, and set to light a fire in the stove. The smell of burning wood soon filled the cabin, adding to the cozy feeling. The first night passed uneventfully. I had brought some canned food and a small propane stove for cooking. After a simple dinner of beans and rice, I sat by the fire with a book, feeling a calm I hadn't felt in months. The cold night air seeped through the cracks in the walls, but the fire kept the cabin warm enough. Outside, the stars shone bright, untouched by city lights. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the soft rush of the creek nearby. I pulled on my boots and went outside, deciding to explore the area. The forest was thick, the ground covered in fallen leaves, moss, and small plants. The trees were mostly pine and maple, their bark rough and dark. I walked along the creek's edge, the water clear and cold, flowing over smooth stones. Felt peaceful. That day, I spent hours wandering the woods, taking photos and jotting notes in my journal. The air was cool but fresh, the scent of pine needles and damp earth sharp and clean. I found a few wildflowers and watched as a pair of deer crossed a clearing. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one untouched by modern life. As the sun began to set, I returned to the cabin, tired but satisfied. I started another fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for the night. I read a bit more, then laid down early, feeling the quiet press against the thin walls. On the third day, I woke to an odd noise outside. It was faint, almost like a scraping or dragging sound, but I couldn't place it. I got up and looked out the window, scanning the woods. Nothing seemed out of place. A few birds flew overhead, and the creek gurgled as usual. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal moving through the brush. I decided to explore a little further that day. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and my camera and headed deeper into the woods. The trail was rough and narrow, mostly dirt with rocks and roots sticking up. The forest grew denser, the sunlight dimmer through the thick canopy. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing where the ground sloped down toward a boggy area. The air was heavy and moist, the smell of decaying leaves strong. I took some photos but didn't linger long. The place felt wrong, unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. On the way back, I kept an eye out for anything unusual, but the forest seemed normal again. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was low and the air cooler. I built a fire, ate, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. That night, the noises outside returned. This time, I could hear something moving around the cabin perimeter. Something heavy, slow, and deliberate. It wasn't animal sounds I recognized. No birds or small mammals. The noises were like footsteps, but irregular, not walking but dragging or shuffling. I sat by the fire, listening, my heart beating faster. The darkness outside the windows seemed to press closer, thick and almost solid. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shadows moving just beyond the window. I told myself to stay calm. There was no reason to panic. Maybe someone else was nearby, hunters or campers. I decided that in the morning, I would leave if the feeling didn't go away. Morning came slow. The light was pale and gray, the sky overcast. I opened the door cautiously and stepped outside, looking around. The forest was still and quiet. No footprints or signs of anyone else around. Just the usual marks of animals, deer tracks, squirrel scurries. I checked my phone, no signal. That was expected. I had brought a small emergency radio, but it was old and didn't pick up anything but static. The isolation was real. If I wanted help, I had to get to the nearest town, and that was at least 20 miles away. I packed a small bag with essentials and decided to hike to the main road later that day. But first, I wanted to make sure everything at the cabin was secure. I checked the windows and door, making sure they were locked and latched as well as possible. While walking around the cabin, I noticed something odd near the back, a set of footprints in the soft earth. They were large and deep, as if made by someone wearing heavy boots. The prints came from the edge of the woods and stopped abruptly at the cabin's foundation. I followed them around, but they didn't continue anywhere else. It was as if someone had stood there, right behind the cabin, and then vanished. The thought sent a chill through me. Who else was out here? How had they gotten so close without me seeing them? I searched the woods nearby but found no sign of recent movement. That afternoon, I started hiking toward the main road. The trail was difficult, overgrown in parts, and the sky darkened with heavy clouds. As I walked, the forest seemed to close in tighter, the sounds quieter. I had a small knife in my pocket and a heavy stick I'd picked up near the cabin, just in case. About 2 miles into the hike, I heard something behind me, a twig snapping sharply. I stopped and turned, but saw nothing, just empty trees and fallen leaves. I quickened my pace, heart pounding, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. Suddenly, I spotted a figure standing between 2 trees ahead. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and a worn hat. His face was shadowed, but his posture was still and quiet. I froze, unsure whether to call out or keep moving. He didn't move, just watched me. I decided to avoid confrontation and veered off the trail slightly to go around him. As I passed, I noticed his eyes, cold and hard, watching every step I took. That moment, a wave of fear crashed over me. I realized this man was likely the one who had been lurking near the cabin. Maybe he had been watching the cabin for days. Maybe he was waiting for me to leave or be vulnerable. I kept walking, not looking back. The forest grew darker as the sun dipped lower, and rain began to fall lightly. I finally reached the main dirt road just as night fell. I was soaked and exhausted, but relieved. I stuck out my thumb, hoping for a passing car. It wasn't long before a pickup truck slowed down. The driver, a middle-aged woman, looked surprised to see someone out here at night. I explained where I was staying and asked if she could take me to the nearest town. She agreed, and I climbed in, shivering and soaked. As we drove away, I looked back at the dense forest, the dark shape of the cabin barely visible in the distance. Back in town, I called the local sheriff's office and reported what I had experienced. They said the area had had problems with squatters and occasional break-ins, especially around remote cabins. A few deputies promised to check the area soon. Over the next few days, I stayed in a motel, waiting for them to search the woods. They found some footprints and evidence of a campsite not far from the cabin, an old fire pit, a torn tarp, and a few scattered belongings. No one was there when they arrived. I never went back to that cabin. The quiet I had sought turned in. It was the fall of 2008 when I drove out to the mountains near Eagle Ridge, a quiet, little-known area in northern Vermont. I was 27 at the time, working a regular job in a small town, just trying to get some space from the noise of the city. The city was too loud, too crowded, and too full of people I didn't know. So, I rented a cabin that was advertised online. A simple wooden cabin, nothing fancy, miles away from anything. It was supposed to be a place where I could read, hike, and just clear my head. The cabin was old but sturdy. It sat near the edge of a thick forest, surrounded by tall pines and maples, whose leaves had just started turning orange and red. The air smelled crisp, clean, and cool. I pulled up in my old car around mid-afternoon and was immediately struck by how quiet everything was. No cars, no people, just birds chirping and the distant rustling of leaves. The cabin had a small porch with 2 rocking chairs. The wood creaked slightly under my boots as I stepped inside. Inside, the place was rustic but clean. A simple kitchen with a propane stove, a small table, a few shelves filled with old books and some canned goods left by the owner. There was a fireplace in the corner of the living room with some logs stacked next to it, and a single bedroom with a bed covered in a thick, woven blanket. The windows were small and had curtains that looked like they had been there for decades. I unpacked slowly, setting my things down. I had brought a backpack with some clothes, my notebook, a few canned foods, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I also brought a thick sweater and some boots. The weather was starting to turn colder at night, and I wanted to be prepared. After unpacking, I made a fire in the fireplace. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, and the warmth spread quickly, chasing away the chill. I sat in one of the rocking chairs with a cup of coffee I had made earlier and stared out the window. The forest outside was dense and darkening with the coming night. I planned to spend the evening reading and writing, trying to catch up on a journal I had started months before. The silence was soothing at first, but as the night went on, I started to notice how loud the silence really was. Every small sound, an animal moving in the underbrush, the wind brushing through the leaves, seemed amplified. It was the kind of quiet that made you listen hard for something to break it. Around 9 p.m., the power went out. I hadn't realized the cabin was completely off-grid, relying only on a small generator that the owner said he started in the morning. Since the generator was off, the cabin was plunged into darkness except for the weak glow from the fireplace. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the windows. The moon was bright, almost full, lighting the forest with a silver glow. I wasn't worried at first. I was used to camping and knew how to manage without electricity. I settled back into the rocking chair with my flashlight and tried to read, but my eyes kept wandering to the windows. Outside, the shadows seemed to shift and stretch. Then I heard it, a low, muffled thud somewhere outside, close to the cabin. Not loud, but definitely there. I froze, my heart beating faster. The wind was calm, the night still. The noise didn't sound like an animal, it was too deliberate, too heavy. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or some small animal knocking something over. But the thud came again, this time followed by a dragging sound. It was slow and uneven, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. I grabbed a second flashlight from the kitchen shelf and turned it on, pointing it toward the window. I scanned the dark trees, but I couldn't see anything. My breath felt heavy in my chest. I decided to check outside. I wrapped myself in a thick jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold and smelled faintly of damp earth and pine. I swept the beam of light across the forest floor, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire behind me and the distant call of an owl. The forest looked calm, but I felt a prickling sense of unease. I shut the door firmly behind me and locked it, then checked the windows and bolts. Everything seemed secure. Back inside, I sat down and tried to focus on my writing. The thudding sounds didn't return, but the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered. Around midnight, I woke suddenly to the sound of glass breaking. It was sharp and loud, like something heavy hitting the window. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the noise. The window by the kitchen was shattered. Small shards of glass scattered on the floor, the pane cracked and jagged. I scanned the area outside the window but didn't see anyone or anything. The forest was still, dark, and quiet again. I immediately looked for something to defend myself with. I found an old metal poker near the fireplace and gripped it tightly. I checked every door and window again, making sure everything was locked or barred. Then, I realized the phone line was dead. No dial tone, no cell service. The cabin was completely cut off. I sat on the floor, close to the fire, the poker in one hand and the flashlight in the other. My mind raced. Who or what could have broken the window? Why? Was it an animal? Maybe a bear, I thought. Bears can be strong enough to break glass if they're desperate for food. But the dragging sound earlier didn't fit with a bear's behavior. And the break was too precise, as if something was thrown or smashed deliberately. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just a raccoon or a hungry animal looking for scraps. I spent the rest of the night in a tense, uneasy state, listening for any more sounds. Every time the wind shifted or a branch cracked, I felt a spike of fear. The next morning, I inspected the broken window in daylight. There were claw marks on the wooden frame outside, deep and wide, too big for a raccoon. I found large footprints in the soft earth near the porch, but they were strange, not quite human, not quite animal. The prints were irregular, like someone had dragged their feet. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, loading everything into the car. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something else. Near the edge of the forest, about 50 yards from the cabin, there was a makeshift campfire. Stones arranged in a circle, ashes still warm. Someone had been here recently. That's when I realized I wasn't the only one out here. Someone had been watching the cabin. I jumped into the car and locked the doors, starting the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest looked peaceful in the daylight, but I knew better. I reported the broken window to the owner and told him I wouldn't be coming back. Later, I learned from the local ranger station that the area had occasional reports of people trespassing or squatting in the woods. They said it wasn't uncommon for drifters or homeless people to set up hidden camps. I never found out who had been near the cabin or why they smashed the window, but I never went back to Eagle Ridge. That night alone in the cabin taught me that the woods are not always a safe escape. Sometimes, the real danger isn't from the wilderness, but from other people hiding in the shadows. I still remember the way the sun looked the morning I drove out to the cabin. It was early October in 1997, the kind of cold morning where your breath turns to smoke before you even fully exhale. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with low clouds that promised rain later in the day. I was 28, freshly off a rough breakup and desperate to be alone. Away from the city noise, from the fake smiles of coworkers and the buzz of a life that felt like it was running on autopilot. I had rented the cabin through a small, barely known website. A tiny wooden shack tucked deep in the woods near a little town called Millstone in northern Vermont. It was old, isolated, and perfect for the kind of solitude I thought I needed. The drive took longer than I expected. The last 20 miles were gravel and dirt roads, winding through thick forests with the trees already losing their leaves. The air smelled like wet earth and pine needles, and I watched the landscape change from neat, tidy farms to dense woods so quiet it felt like the trees were holding their breath. At one point, the road dipped down into a shallow valley, and a thin mist clung to the ground like smoke from a fire that never quite went out. The headlights cut through it, but there was no sign of any other cars or people, just the trees endless and close. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, my stomach twisted a little. The place looked exactly like the photos. A squat, weather-beaten building with faded red paint peeling off the walls, a stone chimney crooked against the roof, and a porch with a swing hanging crookedly from rusty chains. The windows were small and dusty, and the door sagged on its hinges like it had been forgotten. I stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting my face sharply, and heard the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. No birds, no animals, just silence. Inside, the cabin was dim but surprisingly warm. There was a wood stove in the corner, and the smell of old smoke and damp wood filled the air. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the furniture was basic. A small wooden table with 2 chairs, a sagging couch with threadbare cushions, and a bed with a thin mattress pushed against the wall. A shelf held a few dusty books, mostly old nature guides and some faded novels, and there was a small stack of firewood by the stove. The kitchen was tiny, with a rusty sink and a small propane stove. There was no electricity, no phone signal, and no running water beyond a hand pump outside. I unpacked slowly, my fingers numb from the cold, placing my things carefully on the table. I had brought canned food, a flask of water, a flashlight, and some blankets. I wanted to stay for 5 days. 5 days of nothing but quiet, just me and the woods. The first night settled in like a heavy blanket, the wind picking up and rattling the windows. I lit the stove, its warmth fighting back the chill creeping through the walls, and sat by the fire with a book. The dark outside was absolute. Without the city lights, the stars hung heavy and bright, like silver nails hammered into the black sky. Sleep came slowly. The silence was so thick it pressed on my ears, and every creak and groan of the old cabin made me jump a little. I kept telling myself it was just the house settling, or the wind shifting the trees outside. But there was something else too, a feeling deep in my chest, like something was watching, waiting. I shoved the thought away and drifted off. The next day was overcast and cold. I went for a walk along a narrow trail that snaked through the forest behind the cabin. The trees were mostly maples and pines, their branches bare or weighed down with wet leaves. The ground was soft and muddy, and I found animal tracks. Deer, maybe a fox. There was no one else around, no sign of recent human footsteps. The woods felt endless, the trees towering like old sentinels. I walked for hours, following the trail as it twisted deeper and deeper, until I reached a small creek with water so clear I could see the pebbles at the bottom. The quiet was peaceful, but it also felt like the woods were holding secrets. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. A snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. But when I stopped to listen, there was only the wind and the distant call of a crow. I tried to relax, to tell myself I was safe, but the unease clung to me like a shadow. Back at the cabin, I prepared a simple meal. Canned beans heated on the stove, some bread. The day dragged on, and the light dimmed quickly under the heavy clouds. I sat by the window, watching the rain begin to fall in slow, steady drops that blurred the forest into a watercolor wash of gray and green. That night, the feeling came back stronger. The wind was louder, howling around the cabin and rattling the old windows. I lay awake, heart pounding, convinced I could hear footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. At one point, a branch scraped hard against the siding, making a sharp noise that echoed in the silence. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, shining it into the dark. The beam cut through the rain and the trees, but there was nothing there. No figure, no movement. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the storm was making sounds and shadows dance. But sleep didn't come easily. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain pounding on the roof, counting the seconds between each gust of wind. The night stretched on endlessly. The next morning, I found a few muddy footprints near the cabin's porch. They were fresh, and they didn't match my own boots. The prints were large, heavy, and seemed to come from the forest and stop abruptly by the steps. My heart sank. I hadn't heard anyone arrive, hadn't seen a car or any sign of people. Whoever had been here was either very quiet or had come in the night. I debated leaving right away, but the road back was slick with rain and mud, and I didn't want to drive in the dark. Instead, I gathered some wood and made a bigger fire outside, hoping the smoke would keep any visitors away. I also locked the door, checking the old rusty latch twice. I tried to tell myself it was just a hunter or a lost hiker, but the thought didn't settle well. The afternoon passed slowly. I kept the fire burning and sat close to it, my eyes scanning the tree line every few minutes. The woods were darker and wetter than before, the rain turning to a steady drizzle that soaked everything. The smell of wet earth and pine filled the air, and the distant sound of a stream was constant and soothing. But then, as dusk approached, I noticed something else. The footprints had multiplied. Around the cabin, there were dozens of prints, heavy, large, some fresh, some older. They circled the cabin in a loose ring, like something was watching me, waiting. I felt a deep cold settle in my gut, colder than the damp air. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the stove with a knife in my hand, the fire barely holding back the dark. The wind screamed outside, and every creak of the cabin made me jump. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, quick and low to the ground. I shined the flashlight out, but saw nothing. The rain slowed, and the silence pressed back in like a living thing. Morning came, pale and gray. I was exhausted but knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, grabbing my things, locking the door, and heading to the car. As I walked toward the road, I kept glancing behind me, feeling eyes on my back. The drive back was slow, the gravel road slippery with mud. I kept my windows up and the doors locked, glancing in the rearview mirror every few minutes. The forest thinned as I neared the highway, and the familiar signs of civilization felt like a bomb. When I finally reached the first gas station, I stopped and called my sister, my hands shaking. She came to pick me up, and I told her I wasn't coming back to the cabin. It was too isolated, too quiet in the wrong way. I never did find out who or what had left those footprints, but I didn't care. The woods had felt alive that week, watching me, waiting for something. I was glad to leave it all behind. Looking back now, years later, I realize how much the experience changed me. I learned that sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but the unknown people and places we stumble into. And that sometimes the best safety is just getting back to the light. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into the kind of experience that stays with you for years. Looking back, it was the summer of 2013, when I was 29 years old, living in a small town in northern Vermont. I'd been working nonstop for months in a job I didn't love, and the pressure was piling up. So, I decided to rent a small cabin in the woods just outside a tiny village called Maple Ridge. The idea was to spend 3 days alone. No phone, no internet, just me and the wilderness. The cabin itself was nothing fancy but cozy enough. It was a one-room wooden structure with a stone fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a loft for sleeping. The owner told me it was built in the early 70s and hadn't changed much since then. It sat about half a mile from the nearest dirt road, surrounded by dense pine and birch trees. The air smelled like damp wood and fresh earth, and the silence felt thick, almost heavy. When I arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun was just dipping behind the trees. I parked my old Subaru on a narrow path, unloaded my bags, and unlocked the cabin door with a rusty key taped to the front window. Inside, the smell of old wood mixed with a faint hint of mothballs hit me immediately. The floor creaked slightly under my boots as I stepped in, and I noticed the dust motes swirling in the slanting beams of light coming through the windows. I spent the evening setting up. I unpacked my food, mostly canned beans, bread, some dried fruit, and laid out a blanket and pillow on the thin mattress up in the loft. The cabin didn't have running water, so I filled a large jug from a nearby stream I'd found earlier, planning to boil it for drinking. The fireplace looked usable, so I gathered some dry twigs from outside and got a small fire going. It was peaceful in that untouched sort of way, the kind of peace you don't find in cities or even suburbs. The first night was cold. The temperature dropped sharply, and despite the blankets, I woke a few times shivering. I could hear the forest around me, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, and distant calls of owls or other night birds. None of it scared me, really, felt natural. Saturday was a day of small tasks. I walked along the stream, found a spot where the water ran clearer, and filled another jug. I explored a bit, marking the trees with a bit of chalk so I wouldn't lose my way. The forest was dense but not too wild, just enough to feel remote. I noticed some old animal tracks in the dirt, maybe deer or raccoon. At one point, I stumbled on a small clearing where someone had built a fire pit and left behind some burnt logs and scattered trash. The smell was faint but sour, like rotting food mixed with ash. It looked like someone had camped there recently. That evening, I cooked a simple meal over the fire. The flames flickered against the walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. I sat on a crate I'd found in the corner, eating slowly and watching the smoke curl up through the chimney. Outside, the forest was darker than before. The wind had picked up and caused the trees to sway and creak. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the brush beyond the window, but when I looked, there was nothing. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I was alone in the woods, miles from anyone. I went to bed early, feeling tired but content. Sunday, though, was when things started to change. I woke up to a strange sound outside, like soft scraping, almost like someone was dragging a heavy object over dry leaves. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but it sounded deliberate, steady, not random. I got up quietly and peeked out the window. The early morning light barely illuminated the forest, but I could see disturbed branches and a few broken twigs scattered near the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a deer or a moose moving through, but the more I listened, the more uneasy I became. The scraping sound returned, this time accompanied by a faint thud, like something being dropped. The noises came from the side of the cabin that faced the woods, near a cluster of bushes. Curious but cautious, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, careful to keep my footsteps light. The air was crisp, the sky still gray and overcast. As I approached the bushes, I noticed fresh marks on the ground, deep scratches in the dirt, as if something heavy had been dragged there recently. Then, I spotted it, a rusty old crowbar, half buried in the dirt under the bushes. I picked it up slowly, feeling its cold metal against my palm. I tried to shake off the creeping feeling that someone else might be nearby. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, after all. I looked around the perimeter, shining the flashlight into the dark woods, but I saw nothing. No footprints, no signs of human presence except for the crowbar. I put it down inside, locked the door, and double-checked all the windows. For the rest of the morning, I kept the curtains drawn and stayed inside, half expecting someone to show up. But nothing happened. That afternoon, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head, figuring the noises might have been caused by some hiker or woodsman passing by. I followed a narrow trail leading deeper into the forest, keeping track of my marks on the trees. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something odd. An old campsite, much like the one I'd found earlier, but this time it looked more recent. There were footprints in the soft earth around a fire pit, and trash scattered close to a makeshift seat made from logs. I crouched down and examined the footprints. They were large and heavy, the kind that belonged to a man. I estimated the prints were only a day or two old. A sudden cold wash of fear ran through me. Was someone living in the woods nearby? Why hadn't I seen them? Was I really as alone as I thought? I headed back to the cabin faster, my heart pounding. When I arrived, I locked the door again and looked out the window, scanning the forest edges. The sky had turned darker, with thick clouds gathering overhead. Rain was coming. That night, I slept with one eye open. Every little noise made me jump. The wind rattling the window frames, the branches scraping against the roof, the occasional distant crack of a falling limb. Around midnight, I was woken by a sudden, sharp noise, like the sound of a door being forced open or heavy wood scraping against stone. I sat up immediately, frozen. I listened. The sound came from outside the cabin, right near the back door. My mind raced. Did someone break in? Were they trying to get inside? I grabbed the crowbar from beside the fireplace, gripping it tightly. For what felt like forever, I stayed still, straining to hear any other sounds. Nothing.
No footsteps, no voices, no briefing.
Then the noise came again. A low scraping, like a metal object being dragged across the wooden porch. Without thinking, I switched on the flashlight and headed for the door. I opened it just a crack and shone the beam outside. The porch was empty, no sign of anyone or anything. I stepped outside slowly, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. I circled the cabin, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. The forest loomed all around, silent except for the wind. There were no footprints in the mud, no disturbed branches beyond what I had already seen. Nothing to explain the noise. The rational part of me said it was probably an animal or a loose piece of wood shifting in the wind, but the fear in my chest said otherwise. I went back inside and locked every bolt, wedging a heavy chair against the door. Then I sat by the fireplace, keeping the fire alive with dry wood, staring at the shadows it threw on the walls. The night crawled by slowly, every creak and whisper amplified in the quiet. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. Monday morning brought heavy rain and fog so thick it swallowed the trees like a ghostly white sea. I spent most of the day inside, reading a book and trying to ignore the tension that had settled over me. In the afternoon, I heard the faint sound of a vehicle on the dirt road. An old pickup truck, slow and rough. I rushed outside to wave, hoping for company or at least a break in the silence. The truck slowed near the cabin, and a man got out. He was middle-aged, wearing a worn baseball cap and a soaked jacket. He introduced himself with a nod, explaining he lived a few miles down the road and came by to check on the property. He asked if I was all right and if I had seen anyone else around. I told him about the footprints and the noises. He nodded knowingly and told me that sometimes drifters or hunters passed through the area, and the forest could be unpredictable. He gave me a reassuring smile and said the cabin had been empty for months before I arrived. Then he handed me his phone number and said to call if I needed anything. The presence of another person, even briefly, lifted a weight off my shoulders. After he left, I felt calmer, more grounded. That evening, I packed up most of my things and prepared to leave early the next morning. The walk back to the car was long but peaceful. The forest felt less threatening now, more like it had been before. I kept thinking about the noises and the footprints, but they no longer seemed like threats, just signs that the woods were alive in their own quiet way. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a break from my busy life in Denver. I was 28 then, working long hours at a small architecture firm and feeling the weight of the city's noise and stress pressing down on me. The idea of a quiet weekend alone in a cabin somewhere in the Colorado mountains seemed like the perfect escape. Somewhere far from phones, emails, and the constant hum of urban life. I found a small rental cabin through a local listing. It was a modest wooden structure tucked away in the pine forests near a place called Crystal Creek, about 3 hours northwest of Denver. The area was remote, with no cell service, no internet, just thick woods, the sound of a creek, and the open sky. The cabin was old but sturdy, a rough-cut log structure with a stone chimney, small windows, and a porch that looked out into the trees. The owner mentioned it was built in the 1950s and hadn't changed much since then. That kind of place felt right to me, untouched by modern distractions. I packed my bags with essentials. Some canned food, a lantern, a flashlight, matches, a few books, and a heavy wool blanket. I also grabbed my hiking boots and a thick jacket, knowing the mountain air could turn chilly even in July nights. I left on a Friday afternoon, driving the winding roads deeper into the forest, feeling the cityscape shrink behind me with every mile. The sun was dipping low, casting a golden glow over the trees as I finally turned down a dirt road, bouncing on the gravel until I reached the cabin's small parking area. The moment I stepped out of the car, a cool breeze carried the scent of pine and earth. The creek nearby murmured softly, and the forest stretched in every direction, tall evergreens and the occasional aspen. The air was fresh, the kind that fills your lungs with relief. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The place smelled of wood smoke and something faintly musty, but not unpleasant. Dust lay lightly on the furniture, and spider webs clung to the corners of the ceiling. The cabin had a small kitchen area, a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a couch that looked like it hadn't been sat on in months. A narrow staircase led up to a loft bedroom. The windows had heavy curtains that I pulled back to let in the last light of day. After unloading my gear, I built a small fire in the stove. It crackled and warmed the room, throwing shadows against the rough wooden walls. Outside, the forest was darkening fast. The creek's gentle sound was a steady background noise. I settled into the couch with a book, but my mind wasn't calm. There was a strange weight in the air, a quiet tension I couldn't place. The first night passed without incident, except for the usual creaks and groans of an old cabin settling into the night. The wind whispered through the trees, and distant birds called to each other as dawn approached. When morning came, the sunlight spilled warmly through the windows, and the forest seemed peaceful again. I spent the day hiking the trails nearby, breathing deep of the pine-scented air and marveling at how empty the world felt here. I saw no one, just squirrels darting through the underbrush and the occasional deer bounding away at the sound of my steps. It was a perfect kind of isolation. I returned to the cabin as the sun began to lower, tired but satisfied. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner over the stove, I noticed something odd outside. On the edge of the clearing near the cabin's porch, a faint trail of footprints pressed into the dirt. They were muddy and fresh, not mine, definitely not my car's. I followed them cautiously, curious and a bit uneasy. The prints led into the thick woods and stopped abruptly. No sign of who or what made them, just the silence of the trees. I shrugged it off. Maybe another hiker or a hunter passing by. There were cabins scattered around in this forest, after all. But I hadn't seen any cars on the road, and I had not heard any voices. Still, the feeling of being watched crept in, a quiet edge beneath the day's calm. Night fell again, deeper and darker than before. I lit the lantern and sat on the porch, watching the stars slowly blink awake overhead. The Milky Way arched bright and vast, a breathtaking sight far from city lights. I heard the creeks murmur again, steady and reassuring. But then came a new sound, a faint rustling in the trees beyond the clearing. Leaves crackling softly, twigs snapping underfoot. It wasn't close, but it was there. I scanned the shadows, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon moving about. Still, I felt an itch of worry, like something wasn't right. I went inside and locked the door, double-checked the windows, and settled down with the blanket. I tried to read but kept hearing little noises outside. Branches scraping, the crunch of undergrowth. Around midnight, I woke to a louder noise. A sharp thump against the cabin wall, followed by silence. My heart pounded as I sat frozen, straining to hear. Then, footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing just outside. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door a crack. The beam swept the dark, empty clearing. Nothing, no movement. I closed the door and bolted it tight. My mind raced with questions. Who could be out there? Why? The closest neighbors were miles away. The roads were rough and quiet. There was no cell phone signal to call for help. No way to reach anyone. I decided to stay awake until dawn. The night stretched long and tense. Every small sound set my nerves on edge. I kept the lantern burning and the flashlight close. Hours passed. The footsteps never came back. When the first light broke, I felt a cautious relief. I stepped outside, searching the perimeter. On the porch, I found marks on the wood, deep scratches like claws or maybe a tool. The footprints were back near the edge of the clearing, fresher than before, as if someone or something had been circling the cabin all night. I started to think about what I knew of this area. Crystal Creek was isolated, yes, but not abandoned. Hunters, hikers, sometimes people looking to escape for a few days. But this felt different, like someone was watching me, testing me, waiting. I checked the cabin thoroughly, looking for signs of forced entry or anything left behind. Nothing, but the scratches on the porch made me uneasy. I spent the day moving quietly, packing some of my gear ready to leave if needed, but also trying to keep calm. That afternoon, I decided to explore a bit further from the cabin, hoping to find a nearby ranger station or a farmhouse. Maybe if I could find someone, I could tell them what was going on. I walked the dirt roads, dense forest all around, the sun filtering through the canopy. After nearly 2 hours, I saw an old farmhouse through the trees, paint peeling, windows dark but not broken. No cars, no lights. I tried the door, locked. No sign of life. I circled the property and found a rusted mailbox with faded letters spelling a family name. No address or phone number. It was clear the place was abandoned or at least no longer lived in. I headed back, the forest feeling heavier with every step. The silence was oppressive. I hurried, not wanting to be out here alone any longer than necessary. That evening, back at the cabin, the strange sounds started again. At first, just the usual forest noises. Birds, insects, wind in the branches. But as night deepened, the sounds became sharper. Footsteps circling, rustling close, and then faint tapping on the windows. I stayed inside, heart pounding. The scratches on the porch were worse now, deeper, more violent. I found a large piece of firewood and placed it near the door. I sat as still as I could, watching shadows move just beyond the window's edge. At some point during the night, I heard a voice, a single whisper, barely audible, carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was cold and threatening. I gripped the firewood tighter, waiting for the dawn. When morning finally came, I stepped outside carefully. The marks on the porch had become like claw gouges, raw and deep. The footprints circled the cabin multiple times. No sign of where they came from or went. I took a deep breath and decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, locking up the cabin as best I could. I kept an eye on the woods as I drove away, not looking back until I was safely back on the main highway. Later, back in Denver, I learned from a local that Crystal Creek had a strange reputation. Some said it was a place where hunters sometimes took things too far, stalking animals, trespassing on private land, even threatening visitors. There was talk of a man who lived in the woods nearby, reclusive and dangerous, known to scare off anyone he saw as a threat. I never found out who had been circling my cabin that weekend. Maybe it was that man, maybe some other person. But I know I was being watched, tested, made to feel small and vulnerable in a place that seemed so peaceful on the surface. I haven't gone back to Crystal Creek since, but I learned something important. Sometimes, the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the people. I didn't plan on spending the weekend alone in that cabin deep in the woods. Truth be told, I never wanted to be there at all. But it was 1987, I was 29, and I was tired of the city's noise. My job in the office had drained me dry. The fluorescent lights and the endless drone of ringing phones felt like a trap tightening around my chest. So when my uncle offered his small cabin by the edge of the Cascade Mountains for a week, I jumped at the chance for some peace and quiet. The cabin was old, built sometime in the late 50s, made mostly of rough timber with a stone chimney at one end. It sat on a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees that stretched high into the sky, their tops lost in a haze of gray clouds. There was a narrow dirt road leading up to it, barely wide enough for one car, and I remember thinking how isolated it was as I drove up. No neighbors, no cell phone signal, just endless forest. The first day was beautiful. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I unpacked slowly, placing my things on the wooden table that looked like it had been handmade decades ago. The windows were single pane and slightly foggy, but I liked the way the soft light filtered through them. I lit the old cast iron stove and started a fire with some dry logs left in the shed. It wasn't much, but the warmth spread quickly, and I felt a rare comfort wash over me. I spent the afternoon walking the trails near the cabin. The forest was alive with sounds, birds calling, the rustle of small animals in the bushes, the distant crack of a branch under a deer's hooves. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The silence between these sounds was heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By evening, I was back inside the cabin, cooking a simple dinner of canned beans heated over the stove and some bread I had brought along. The small radio on the shelf gave static and crackled with old rock music from a station far away. I felt small, surrounded by this vast wilderness. That first night, sleep was hard to come by. The old cabin creaked and settled, making sounds that I wasn't used to. Outside, the wind picked up, pushing branches against the windows. I lay awake on the narrow bed, the wool blanket pulled tight around me, my ears straining to catch every noise. But it wasn't until close to midnight that something truly disturbed the quiet. At first, it was a soft thud, like something heavy dropping outside. Then another and another. It wasn't rhythmic or regular, just sudden and heavy, like someone throwing rocks or hitting trees with sticks. I froze, heart hammering. I strained my eyes toward the window, but all I could see was darkness, broken only by the faint outlines of trees swaying in the wind. I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal knocking over branches, but the sounds felt too deliberate. The noises stopped abruptly, leaving the night utterly silent again. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. When morning finally came, I tried to shake off the unease with a long walk. The forest looked calm, the sun filtering gently through the needles. But as I moved through the trees, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the damp soil near the cabin, large and heavy, unlike anything a deer or a bear would leave. The prints led from the edge of the clearing to the front door, then disappeared into the forest on the other side. My heart sank. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here. Who else could have been so close? For a moment, I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself to stay calm. Maybe the prints were from a hunter or someone else camping nearby. It was still early, and I wanted to give myself a chance. That day, I fixed the broken latch on the cabin door and inspected the windows. The cabin wasn't exactly secure, but it was the best I could do. I spent the afternoon reading by the fire, trying to focus on the stories, but my mind kept wandering back to the footprints. Were they watching me? Did someone come back after I saw them? That night, I took a flashlight and walked around the clearing, checking the perimeter. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making it hard to see. As I moved slowly, the beam of the flashlight caught on something shiny near a tree. I moved closer and found a small hunting knife stuck in the bark, its blade dulled and stained with rust. I didn't touch it. Instead, I took a picture with my camera to show the police if I ever got back. The next day, I tried to ignore the growing sense of danger, but the feeling clung to me like cold sweat. I spent more time inside the cabin, boarding up some of the lower windows with spare wood I found in the shed. I kept the fire burning and my flashlight and knife close by. The radio only brought static, but at least it gave some background noise. By the third night, I was exhausted. I could barely sleep, jumping at every sound. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Around midnight, I heard the heavy thuds again. This time, the noise came from the back of the cabin, the side facing the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and crept to the door, heart pounding. The wind had died down, but the night was pitch black. I opened the door slowly, shining the light into the trees. For a long moment, nothing. Then, just beyond the clearing, I saw a figure. A man standing completely still, watching the cabin. I couldn't see his face, but the shape was unmistakable. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes that blended with the shadows. I froze, not daring to breathe. Suddenly, he moved, not running or shouting, just walking away into the woods like he belonged there. I watched until the darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, I was too shaken to stay. I packed everything in silence, the unease settling deep inside my chest. As I drove down the bumpy dirt road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following. But there was only empty forest behind me. Back in town, I reported everything to the sheriff, showing him the photo of the knife and describing the footprints and the figure. They said they would check the area, but I never heard anything back. I told myself it was probably some hunter or a local who liked to scare people. It took weeks for the anxiety to fade. I avoided going back to the cabin, and when I did, it was always with a group. But the memory never left me. The feeling of being watched, the dark figure standing at the edge of the trees. It reminded me that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're real people, real threats hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. And maybe that's the lesson I learned the hard way. Nature is beautiful, but it can be dangerous in ways you don't expect. And being alone in the wilderness doesn't mean you're safe. Sometimes the most frightening thing is knowing there's someone out there, just beyond your sight, watching you, and you can't do a thing about it. I had always wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the constant rush, the endless hum of people and traffic. I felt drained after the long year of work, and something about the idea of a cabin in the woods felt like the perfect way to reset. I found a place online, a small rental cabin in northern Vermont, near a small town called Westford. The listing promised peace, quiet, and nature untouched by human hands. It was simple and rustic, no electricity, no cell service, just the basics. It was 2019, late September, and the leaves were turning bright colors, hinting that fall was fully settling in. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, driving a battered old car along winding country roads that seemed to narrow the closer I got to the cabin. The GPS signal dropped long before I reached the final dirt track that led to the cabin's driveway. The air smelled fresh and clean, a mix of pine needles, damp earth, and smoke from distant chimneys. I was used to city air, thick with exhaust and dust, so this hit me like a wave of something pure and alive. The cabin sat just at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods. It was made of rough-hewn logs, darkened by years of weather, with a small porch and 2 windows facing the forest. I parked the car on a patch of uneven ground, grabbed my backpack, and started unloading. Inside, the cabin was dim but cozy. There was a wood stove in the corner, a table with a couple of chairs, and a simple bed with a thick wool blanket folded at the foot. The floor was rough pine planks, creaky under my feet. I unpacked slowly, trying not to rush. I'd brought food for 3 days, a lantern with extra batteries, a heavy knife I kept in the glove box, a first aid kit, and a book. My plan was simple: spend 3 nights alone, hiking during the day, reading and resting at night.
No internet, no distractions.
Just silence. The first night was quiet in a way I hadn't known before. No cars, no sirens, no distant voices. Just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. I built a fire in the stove, the crackling flames casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the moon was bright, and I could see stars through the window. I felt calm, almost peaceful. The next morning, I woke early, before sunrise. The air was crisp, a cold bite reminding me that fall was moving toward winter. I made coffee on a small camping stove and sat on the porch, wrapped in my jacket, watching fog roll in low between the trees. The woods around the cabin looked untouched, dense and deep with pine, birch, and maple. I spent the day hiking along a marked trail nearby, the ground covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. Every so often, I'd hear a woodpecker tapping or a squirrel darting in the underbrush. As the day went on, the sun climbed higher but never felt hot. The forest was alive with color and sound, but something subtle began to nag at me, a feeling of being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination or maybe a deer hidden in the trees. I'd always been a little jumpy in the woods, but I liked to believe it was respect for the wilderness, not fear. Back at the cabin, I prepared a simple meal, canned beans heated over the stove with some bread and cheese. I kept the lantern lit as the light outside faded. The shadows grew longer and the sounds of the forest changed. More rustling, the distant call of an owl, the snap of a twig breaking underfoot. I tried to read but kept glancing toward the window, feeling the weight of the dark woods pressing close. That night, I heard something different. Not an animal, not the wind, but a soft crunching sound coming from just outside. I froze, my heart pounding. It was slow, deliberate steps, not hurried or panicked. The kind of sound a person might make walking carefully on dry leaves. I reached for the knife I'd left on the table and moved toward the door. The cabin door was old, heavy wood, but I wasn't sure it would stop anyone determined to come inside. I didn't open it. I waited, listening. The sound stopped after a few minutes, replaced by silence. I waited longer, holding my breath, until finally I convinced myself it was gone. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. The rational part of me fought to push back the rising fear. The next day, I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, chopping wood to keep the stove warm, keeping an eye on the windows. The sky was overcast, and the forest outside looked darker, wetter. I told myself I was just tired, maybe hungry, maybe lonely. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, close to the cabin. In the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. My backpack, which I always kept near the bed, was slightly moved. Not far, just enough that it caught my eye. I was sure I'd left it exactly where it was. I searched the cabin quickly, but nothing was missing, except for a small pocket knife I'd packed as a backup. I hadn't noticed it gone until then. Panic didn't hit me at once, but unease settled deep in my chest. I spent the rest of the day locking the door with a heavy piece of wood and barricading the windows with extra logs I found stacked near the back porch. I didn't want to believe that someone had been inside while I slept, but the evidence was there. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. I kept the stove fire going, the cabin warm and bright with its flickering light. Around midnight, I heard the crunching again. Slow steps outside. This time it was closer, right outside the door. I didn't dare look. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly moved toward the back door. There, I saw footprints in the soft earth and fallen leaves. Fresh, muddy human footprints. They circled the cabin once and disappeared into the woods. My mind raced with questions. Who could it be? Why would someone be stalking this empty cabin? Was it just a prank? A desperate person hiding out? Something worse? The next morning, I debated leaving right away, but I also didn't want to drive the long, rough road alone with the thought that someone might be waiting. Instead, I decided to hike back to the main road and call for a ride. My phone had no signal at the cabin, but if I got close enough to the highway, I might get a bar. I packed quickly, making sure I had water, food, and the knife. The woods felt different in daylight, less menacing but still dense and shadowy. I followed a faint trail I'd seen the day before, leading to a small stream, then up a ridge, hoping to find a better vantage point or a road. As I walked, I stayed alert, listening for any sounds. The woods were quieter than the day before, almost too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the crunch of my boots on leaves and sticks. About an hour into the hike, I came to a clearing. It was small, ringed with tall pines, but the center was muddy and churned up like something big had been there recently. Then I noticed it. Pieces of cloth caught on branches, scraps of torn fabric that looked like they came from a jacket or a shirt. I pulled back, heart pounding. It wasn't mine. I pressed on, desperate now to reach the road. When I finally broke through the trees onto a narrow gravel road, I pulled out my phone. One bar. I called the local police station and explained my situation as best as I could, voice shaking. They promised to send a unit to check the cabin. As I waited for help, I sat on the side of the road, watching the woods. It was quiet but tense, like the whole forest was holding its breath. When the police arrived an hour later, I led them back to the cabin. They searched carefully but found no one. No signs of forced entry, no tracks beyond the ones I had seen. The torn fabric was gone. My missing pocket knife was never found. They told me it could have been a homeless person or someone hiding, but there was no evidence of any crime. Still, they urged me to stay somewhere safer. I left that night, driving back toward the city under a sky full of stars. The cabin, the woods, the footsteps, they stayed with me. I realized how easy it was for someone to hide in places like that, places so isolated and quiet that you could hear them coming but not see them until it was too late. I didn't go back to that cabin. I haven't spent a night alone in the woods since, but the memory of those footsteps, slow and deliberate outside the door, stays with me. A reminder that some fears don't come from stories or ghosts. They come from real things, real people, real danger, lurking just beyond the thin walls of a lonely cabin in the woods. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of city life. I was 29 years old then, working as a graphic designer in Seattle, and the constant noise and stress had started to wear me down. I had been craving silence and solitude, so when I found the old cabin listed for rent in the Cascade Mountains, about 100 miles northeast of Seattle, I thought it would be the perfect escape. The cabin was small, isolated, and far from any neighbors or roads, just the way I wanted it. The cabin was owned by an older couple who only used it during the winter months for skiing, so they let it out in the summer. The rent was cheap and I could stay there for 2 weeks. I packed my car with all the essentials: food, water, clothes, a small first aid kit, books, and a battery-powered lantern since the cabin had no electricity in the summer. The nearest electricity was at the neighbor's place, half a mile away through the woods, but I didn't plan to rely on it. The drive was long but peaceful. The closer I got to the cabin, the narrower and rougher the dirt road became. Eventually, the car barely fit between the trees on either side. I had to be careful not to scrape the paint or get stuck in mud puddles hidden in the shadows of the tall pines. When I finally pulled up, I saw the cabin sitting quietly among the trees, its wood faded and weathered, but sturdy. The porch sagged slightly, and the screen door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, pine needles, and a faint hint of mothballs. It was simple: a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a table with 2 chairs, a worn-out couch, and a tiny bedroom in the back with a bed and a small dresser. There was no bathroom inside, only an outhouse a few steps from the back door. The windows were small and had old curtains, letting in filtered light. It was perfect for what I wanted. No distractions, no noise, just the sounds of the forest. The first few days were exactly what I hoped for. I woke up early, brewed coffee on the propane stove, and sat outside on the porch watching the sun rise between the trees. The forest was alive with birdsong, the rustle of squirrels, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. I spent my days reading, hiking on nearby trails, and sketching in my notebook. At night, the stars were so bright they almost hurt to look at. I kept the lantern close and a flashlight in my pocket when I went outside to relieve myself at the outhouse. I didn't worry. The forest felt calm and safe. But on the 4th night, something changed. It started with a sound. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon scratching at something. The cabin sat on a slight hill, and the wind sometimes made the trees groan and creak. But this sound was different, slower, heavier, and more deliberate. It was coming from the woods just beyond the clearing where the cabin sat. I lay awake in bed, listening carefully. The sound was like something dragging against the ground. A heavy thud every few seconds, slow and steady. It lasted for about 5 minutes, then stopped. My heart beat faster. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar moving through the brush. The area was known for wildlife, after all. But I also remembered the neighbor had told me last year a hunter went missing nearby during the winter. The thought made my skin crawl, but I finally fell asleep. The next day, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was imagining things because I was alone. Still, I noticed other little things. My food supply was untouched, but in the morning, the small pile of firewood I had stacked near the porch looked disturbed, as if someone or something had moved a few logs around. I was sure I had left it neat the night before. I looked around carefully but saw no footprints or signs of people. I told myself again it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, a big one, or even a bear. I checked my hunting knife and kept it nearby, just in case. On the 6th night, the noises came again, but this time they were closer. The dragging sound started just outside the cabin, then moved around to the back where the outhouse stood. I stayed frozen in bed, listening. The sound stopped suddenly, replaced by silence, then a faint, low grunt. It wasn't an animal noise I recognized. It was a deep, heavy breath, like someone breathing hard in the dark. The next morning, I found scratches on the wooden frame of the outhouse door. Deep marks, made by something with long claws or nails. My heart sank. I had never seen marks like those in the woods before. I took pictures with my camera phone, even though I didn't expect to have service out there. The pictures saved to the memory, but no signal. I felt like I was being watched. That day, I decided to hike toward the neighbor's cabin. Maybe I could ask if they had seen anything strange. The neighbor, a man named Jim, was in his 60s and lived there year-round. His cabin was about a mile away through dense woods. The hike was difficult because the forest floor was thick with ferns and underbrush, but the sun was shining, and I felt better with some human contact. Jim was a quiet man but friendly enough. When I told him about the sounds and the scratches on the outhouse, his face went pale. He warned me not to wander alone after dark. He said some people had been hunting illegally in the area, and they could be dangerous. He told me there had been reports of trespassers who weren't afraid to threaten anyone who got in their way. I thanked him and headed back to the cabin, feeling uneasy but reassured that I wasn't just imagining things. That night, I set extra traps and barricaded the outhouse door with a thick branch. I kept my knife and a baseball bat close. The dragging noises came again, closer, louder, but I didn't hear the breathing this time. I stayed awake all night, staring at the window, waiting for whatever it was to come into the clearing. But it never did. The next day, I found one of the traps I had set was triggered but empty. Nothing caught, no footprints, just the bent wire and a broken branch nearby. I checked around and noticed faint footprints leading away from the cabin into the thicker woods. They looked like heavy boots, but I couldn't be sure. Whoever it was, they knew the area well. The days passed and the tension grew. I kept hearing noises outside after dark. Footsteps, dragging, low grunts, but no one ever showed themselves. I stopped going to the outhouse at night, instead using an old bucket in the corner of the bedroom. I kept the curtains drawn tight and the doors locked. One afternoon, I was hiking a little farther from the cabin, trying to clear my head, when I stumbled on a strange sight. There was a shallow pit in the dirt, about 4 feet across and 2 feet deep. Around the pit were several pieces of torn fabric and scraps of food, canned beans, a half-empty bottle of whiskey. It looked like someone had been camping illegally nearby. I realized that the sounds and signs could be coming from these trespassers, men who might be homeless, desperate, or dangerous. My unease turned to fear. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding, knowing that I wasn't just dealing with wild animals anymore. That night, the noises were worse. The dragging and footsteps circled the cabin. I heard muffled voices, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. I stayed inside, hiding in the dark, clutching my knife. The battery lantern flickered, threatening to go out. Suddenly, I heard the screen door rattle violently. Someone was trying to get in. I held my breath, waiting. After a moment, the rattling stopped. I don't know if they gave up or if they were just testing me. The next morning, I found the door handle scratched, the screen torn in several places, and the porch floor stamped with heavy boot prints. I realized they had been here trying to break in. I called Jim on my way back to his cabin to warn him and ask for help, but again, no signal. It was as if I was cut off from the world. Jim was worried when I reached him. He said he'd been tracking the trespassers but hadn't caught them yet. He suggested I pack up and leave before things got worse. But I had one more day left on my rental, and I wasn't ready to give up just yet. That evening, I prepared for the worst. I barricaded all the windows with wooden boards I found in the shed, jammed heavy furniture against the doors, and made sure I had a clear escape route through the back door and into the forest. I kept my phone charged, even though it had no signal. When night fell, the noises came back immediately. The dragging, footsteps, and grunts echoed all around the cabin. I could hear the trespassers moving through the underbrush just beyond the clearing. Suddenly, the front door burst open with a loud crash. The barricades gave way, and 2 men stepped inside. They were rough-looking, wearing dirty clothes and carrying makeshift weapons, a baseball bat and a large knife. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they'd hear it. But I stayed calm, took a deep breath, and did something I hadn't planned. I reached for the propane stove and turned it on, carefully tipping the burner to create a small flame. Then I grabbed a metal pot and filled it with water from my supply. I lifted the pot and threw it right at one of the men. The scalding water splashed across his face and chest. He screamed, dropping the bat, clutching his burning skin. The other man froze, eyes wide. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to take a break from my usual city life. I was 28 then, working long hours in a cramped office in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, drowning in paperwork and fluorescent lights. The daily grind had been wearing me down for years, and I felt like I needed to get away, somewhere quiet and untouched by the noise of the city. That's how I ended up renting an old cabin, tucked deep in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, about 50 miles north of the town of Rhinelander. The cabin was basic, barely modern, but it was perfect for what I wanted. Peace, silence, and a chance to be alone with my thoughts. The drive up was long and uneventful, winding through narrow roads lined with towering pines, their needles thick and sharp, carpeting the forest floor with a deep green and gold mix. By the time I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees and bathing everything in a warm, amber light. The cabin sat just off a dirt track, isolated from any other houses or cabins. The owner had warned me in the rental agreement that there was no cell reception and electricity was limited, running only on a generator that I'd have to fuel myself. I had packed carefully. A small supply of canned food, a flashlight with extra batteries, a few books, a camping stove, and enough firewood stacked outside to last a week. The cabin was about 700 square feet, with 2 rooms and a tiny bathroom that had a sink but no running water, just a well nearby. The interior was rough but sturdy. Wooden floors, walls made of pine logs, a fireplace, and a small kitchen counter. I liked that it felt untouched by time, like stepping back a few decades, which was exactly what I wanted. That first night, the forest felt alive. I sat by the fireplace, feeling the warmth spread through my body, watching the flames flicker and dance. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, and the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves reminded me I wasn't completely alone. But it was the kind of presence that felt natural, wild, but not threatening. I told myself this was exactly what I needed to recharge, to breathe again. The next few days fell into a slow rhythm. I'd wake early, make coffee on the stove, then walk for miles on the trails that crisscrossed the forest. The trees were thick, the air fresh and cold in the morning, and I kept my eyes peeled for deer or birds. There was a small lake a couple of miles away, where I sometimes sat and watched the water ripple with the wind. The forest was calm, and I felt myself relax more with each passing day. The nights, however, were different. On the 3rd night, I was sitting in the cabin, reading a book by the fire, when I heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind shaking the branches, but it was too steady and deliberate to be just nature. I put down my book and sat still, listening. The sound was soft, like footsteps, slow and careful, moving along the edge of the cabin, then stopping. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly opened the door, shining the beam out into the darkness. Nothing, only the thick blackness of the forest and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I looked around, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. I closed the door, locked it, and went back inside. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept thinking about the noise, about someone or something being so close and silent at the same time. The following morning, I checked the area around the cabin. The dirt path near the door was disturbed, fresh footprints visible in the soft earth. They looked like heavy boots, not animal tracks. I studied them carefully. They led around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the woods. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here during the night. But the cabin was so isolated, why would anyone come all this way? I told myself it was probably just hunters passing through or maybe a local checking the area. I had no real reason to be afraid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. For the rest of the day, I kept the door locked and the windows shut. I stayed close to the cabin and didn't go far on my walks. That night, the thumping came back, louder and closer this time. It started around midnight and lasted for nearly an hour. I was frozen, listening as the sounds moved slowly around the cabin's perimeter, stopping now and then. I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The wind had died down, and everything outside felt eerily still, except for those heavy steps. When the noise finally stopped, I waited another hour before I allowed myself to try to sleep. But the adrenaline kept me wide awake, and I barely closed my eyes before dawn. The next morning, I inspected the footprint area again. This time, the prints were deeper, more distinct, and there were more of them, at least 4 or 5 different boot sizes. I decided to check the small well behind the cabin to see if anything was missing or disturbed. The well had a hand pump that I was supposed to use to get fresh water. When I arrived, I noticed the pump handle was bent slightly, and the dirt around the well looked freshly dug. Someone had been there. It made my skin crawl. Whoever was coming to the cabin wasn't just passing through. They were paying attention to my supplies, my water. I thought about leaving, but it was still early in my trip, and I didn't want to give in to fear so quickly. Instead, I started preparing. I locked the cabin door with an old deadbolt I found in the kitchen, barricaded the windows with chairs and heavy furniture, and kept a large knife close by. I didn't have a gun. I was never one for weapons, but I was ready to defend myself if I had to. That afternoon, I sat inside and watched the forest through a crack in the boarded-up window. The trees stood tall and silent, but every now and then, I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow shifting behind a tree, a glimpse of a boot among the fallen leaves. I felt like I was in a trap, and there was no one coming to save me. On the fifth night, the footsteps didn't just circle the cabin. They began pounding on the door, hard and loud. I could hear the wood shaking under the blows, the lock rattling. I held the knife tight, pressed my back against the wall, and waited. The pounding stopped after what felt like an eternity. Then silence. The forest was still again. I thought about calling the police, but there was no cell service. I had a satellite phone for emergencies, but it was out of battery. I hadn't charged it properly before coming. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and I wasn't sure if anyone would believe me or come quickly enough. I was alone with only the forest and whoever was outside. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, listening to the wind and every small noise outside, trying to figure out what the person wanted or who they were. Were they trying to scare me away, rob me, or was there something more dangerous? The next morning, I noticed something new. The front door had deep scratch marks around the lock, as if someone had tried to force it open with a crowbar or knife. I inspected the windows again. The barricades had been pushed and bent, some even knocked over. Whoever had come last night was getting bolder. I knew I had to do something, but what? I couldn't just sit and wait for them to come back with tools and break in for good. I decided to hike out to get help. The main dirt road was about a mile away, and from there I hoped to find a town or at least a working phone. I packed a small bag with my essentials: water, some food, the flashlight, and the knife. Before leaving, I locked the cabin door as best I could and left a note taped inside the window, hoping someone might see it if they checked the cabin while I was gone. Then I set out through the dense trees, careful to stay on the trail. The walk was tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. The forest that had felt so peaceful at first now seemed hostile and cold. I didn't hear footsteps behind me, but I could feel a presence. My heart pounded, and my breath came in short gasps. After about 45 minutes, I reached the dirt road. It was empty and quiet, but I was relieved to see tire tracks. At least someone else had been here recently. I started walking toward where I thought the ranger station should be, hoping I was heading the right way. About 2 miles down the road, I found an old pickup truck parked by the side. The doors were locked, but the windows were cracked open slightly. There was no one around, but the truck looked like it had been used recently. My hope was that the owner might be nearby or come back soon. I waited by the truck for an hour. Just as I was about to give up, a man appeared from the woods on the opposite side of the road. He looked middle-aged, wearing dirty work boots and a flannel shirt. I waved and called out, but my voice was weak from fear and exhaustion. He noticed me and came over cautiously. I explained the situation briefly, pointing back toward the cabin. He listened, nodding slowly, then said he knew the area well and had heard rumors about people breaking into cabins lately. Apparently, a group of locals had been sneaking into the forest, stealing supplies and sometimes threatening renters like me. The man offered to drive me back to the cabin with his pickup and help me report the situation. It was the fall of 1998 when I first decided to rent that cabin in the mountains of Western Virginia. I was 27 then, working a dead-end job in a nearby town, and felt the need to get away from the noise of everyday life. The city felt suffocating after a while, and the idea of being alone in the woods, away from the usual buzz of traffic and crowds, sounded like a relief. My plan was simple: spend a week in the cabin, disconnect, read, hike a bit, and just be by myself. The cabin was located deep in a forested area near a small, barely marked dirt road. The land around it was thick with tall pine and oak trees, their leaves turning shades of orange, red, and yellow in the chill of autumn. I remember driving the last few miles on that rough road, my old truck rattling and bumping over stones and fallen branches. The sun was already dipping behind the hills when I pulled up, leaving the forest in deep shadows. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. Weathered wooden walls, a stone chimney on one side, and a narrow porch with a creaky wooden swing. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and old smoke. The floor was rough hardwood with a few rugs thrown around. A fireplace sat in the corner of the main room, surrounded by some old, comfortable-looking chairs. The kitchen was tiny, with a small stove and a few cupboards stocked with basic supplies. There was a narrow staircase leading up to a loft where the bedroom was. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect for what I needed: quiet, solitude, and a chance to reset. I unpacked quickly, set out a few things on the table, and then stepped outside for a moment. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. The silence was deep, nothing but the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. It felt peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced for a long time. That first night, I made a fire in the fireplace, cooked a simple dinner on the stove, and settled in with a book. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the branches and making the cabin creak. It was an old structure, after all, and these sounds were to be expected. Still, the darkness outside felt thick, almost heavy. I'd lit a couple of lamps inside, but the shadows clung to the corners of the room. As the night deepened, I heard noises from outside: snapping twigs, the faint shuffling of something moving in the brush. I told myself it was just wildlife. There were deer and raccoons and maybe foxes around here. Nothing unusual. Still, I stayed close to the fire, the warmth comforting against the chill that crept in under the cabin's cracks. The next day, I decided to explore the woods. I packed a small bag with some water, snacks, and a map I'd brought along. The forest was dense, the trees close together, their trunks covered in moss and lichen. The ground was a thick carpet of fallen leaves that muffled my steps. I walked carefully, trying to stay on some kind of path, but soon realized I was deeper than I thought. The silence was overwhelming. No birds sang, no wind rustled. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. At one point, I spotted some old tree markings, signs that hunters or hikers had passed this way years ago. I made a mental note of the direction and headed back before the light started to fade. Back at the cabin, I felt the relief of familiarity. The doors creaked, the smell of pine, the rough texture of the wooden table, all grounded me after being lost in that silent maze. That evening, as the sun set, the cold hit harder. I built the fire up stronger, glad for the heat. On the third day, things started to feel different. I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps outside, close to the cabin. I looked out the window, but there was no one in sight. The forest was still. I checked the door, locked tight, and went outside to inspect the area. No signs of anyone, only a few broken branches on the ground, maybe an animal passing through. I brushed it off as my imagination. Later that afternoon, while chopping some firewood, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They were fresh, deep impressions made by heavy boots. I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day. Whoever it was had come very close but left no sign of stopping or knocking. I stared at those prints for a long time. The thought of someone else out here, uninvited, made my skin crawl. That night was the hardest. I heard the footsteps again, this time circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. The windows rattled in their frames as if someone was testing the glass. I didn't dare go outside. I sat close to the fireplace, a large kitchen knife on the table beside me, and waited for the first light of dawn. Every sound outside made me jump. The crack of a branch, the scraping of leaves, even the hoot of an owl. By morning, the footprints had disappeared. I looked all around the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. No tire marks on the road, no discarded trash, nothing. Just the forest, quiet and still. On the fourth day, I decided not to go out. I stayed inside, keeping the doors locked and the fire burning. I double-checked the windows and set a few traps I'd brought for small animals, just in case. The sense of being watched was heavy. Every time I looked out, I saw nothing but the endless trees. Late afternoon, I found my phone had no signal. That was expected out here, but it added to the feeling of isolation. I tried the radio, static, no stations. No way to call for help if I needed it. As evening fell, the footsteps returned. They were louder now, more confident. They stopped at the porch, the wood creaking under weight. I held my breath and gripped the knife tighter. The noise stayed for a long time, then moved around the cabin, always staying just out of sight. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going all night, watching the shadows through the windows. My mind raced with thoughts. Was someone out there with a weapon? Were they lost? Dangerous? I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was being paranoid. On the 5th day, I woke early and made coffee. The morning was cold and foggy, the trees swallowed by mist. I felt trapped in a gray world. When I went outside to clear some dead branches near the porch, I found a scrap of cloth caught on a bush, a piece of a shirt or jacket, faded and torn. My heart thudded hard. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing by. They'd left something behind. I picked it up carefully, my hands trembling. The idea of an unknown person lurking near my cabin was terrifying. I spent the day preparing. I moved furniture in front of the windows, made a makeshift weapon from a heavy metal rod, and kept the fire stoked. I knew I couldn't stay locked in forever, but I wasn't ready to leave either. That evening, the footsteps came again, but this time they stopped at the door. I heard the faint scraping of metal on wood. Someone was trying to force it open. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the rod and stood by the door. The noise stopped suddenly. Then, faintly, I heard breathing outside. I held my breath, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded into the woods. I stayed awake all night, listening for any sign of a return. On the 6th day, I considered leaving. I packed some things, ready to get back to civilization. But before I left, I decided to check the perimeter one last time. I walked slowly, eyes scanning the trees. Then I found it, a small campfire site, barely used but still warm. Nearby were footprints, not mine, not like the heavy boots, but smaller, lighter. I saw a few scraps of trash, a crumpled food wrapper, an empty water bottle. It dawned on me someone was living close by, maybe homeless or hiding out in the woods. That explained the footsteps, the noises. They hadn't tried to hurt me, at least not yet, but their presence was a threat. I went back to the cabin, heart heavy. I had to decide, stay and risk another night or leave and never come back. I chose to leave. On the 7th day, I woke before dawn, packed everything, and loaded my truck. As I drove down the dirt road, the first light of morning lit up the forest in gold and orange. I glanced back once at the cabin, small and quiet, nestled among the trees. That was the last time I stayed there. The experience stuck with me for years. The feeling of being watched, the unknown presence so close, but unseen. The isolation, the silence that could suddenly feel threatening. I never found out who or what had been living near that cabin. The police didn't take it seriously when I reported the incidents later. No one else had seen or heard anything, but I know what I felt that week. The cold fear of being vulnerable, of sharing your space with a stranger who might not be friendly. Sometimes I wonder if they were watching me still, from deep in those woods, waiting for the right moment. But I never went back to find out. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the city and head to the woods for a solo retreat. I was 26 then, tired from years of working in a noisy office and craving some peace and quiet. My friend had told me about a small cabin tucked away near a lake in the northern part of Vermont, a place that wasn't popular or crowded, where the forest was thick and the only sounds were those of nature. I wanted nothing more than to be alone with the trees and the wind for a few days, to clear my head and maybe find some clarity in the quiet. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town, a small dirt road leading deeper into the woods. I packed the essentials: food, a few cans of beans and soup, a small propane stove, a flashlight with extra batteries, a good knife, a fire starter, and some warm clothes. I wasn't expecting much comfort, and the cabin was nothing fancy. just wood walls, a creaky floor, a single room with a small bed in the corner, a table, and a wood stove. The window looked out onto a patch of forest that sloped down toward a still lake, hidden behind tall pines. When I arrived, the air was crisp, carrying that sharp smell of pine needles and wet earth. The sky was gray and low, promising rain. I dropped my bags inside and closed the creaky wooden door behind me. The silence hit me immediately, thicker than I'd imagined. No cars, no voices, no machines. Just the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional bird. I set about making a fire in the stove and unpacking. The cabin smelled old but clean, with the faint scent of dust and wood smoke from previous visitors. As evening fell, I lit a candle on the table and sat by the window, watching the dark shadows stretch across the forest floor. The lake was almost invisible now, just a dark blur beyond the trees. I felt a strange mix of calm and unease. The quiet was so complete, it made my ears feel like they were ringing. The first night was cold. I had brought a thick sleeping bag but still woke several times shivering, the old cabin walls doing little to keep the chill out. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees groan and creak. At one point, I thought I heard a snapping twig just beyond the window, but when I looked, nothing was there except the swaying branches. I told myself it was nothing, just a deer or a rabbit moving through the underbrush. I tried to focus on my breathing, willing myself to relax. The silence eventually lulled me back to sleep. The next morning, I woke early to the smell of damp wood and moss. Outside, the forest was wet from overnight rain. The ground was soft underfoot, leaves and pine needles slick with moisture. I decided to explore the nearby trails before the weather worsened. I grabbed my backpack, packed some water and a small first aid kit, and stepped out into the cool, misty morning. Walking through the forest was peaceful at first. The thick carpet of fallen leaves muffled my footsteps. The trees were tall and old, their trunks wide and rough with age. Birds flitted between branches, calling softly. The lake was just a short walk downhill, and the path wound gently through the pines. As I neared the water, I noticed something strange. On the far side of the lake, among the trees, I could see a figure, just a shadow really barely visible through the mist. I froze, heart pounding. It was too far to tell if it was a person or an animal. I stared for a few moments, but the figure didn't move. Then it vanished, disappearing behind a cluster of trees. I told myself again it was nothing. The mind plays tricks in unfamiliar places, especially when you're alone and on edge. I took some deep breaths and went down to the water's edge. The lake was calm, dark green, with a thin layer of fog drifting over the surface. I ran my hand through the cold water and looked up at the sky. The clouds were thickening. I headed back to the cabin just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The trail was slippery, and I had to slow down to keep my footing. When I got back, I shut the door tightly and built a fire in the stove. The cabin filled with warm light and the sound of crackling wood. As the rain beat down outside, I sat at the table, eating a can of soup warmed on the stove. I glanced around the cabin, feeling small and exposed. It was a simple place and I was a stranger in it. The isolation felt heavy. My thoughts drifted to the shadow I had seen at the lake. Why was someone out there? Was it a hunter or maybe another camper? I hadn't passed any other cars on the way in. I tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on the fire, but it was difficult. The storm made the cabin feel closed in like a box. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The old wood creaked in the wind, and I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. That night, the wind howled, rattling the windows and bending the trees. I lay awake, listening to the noises outside. The sharp snap of branches, the distant crack of a falling limb, the rush of rain against the roof. At one point, I heard a faint tapping at the door. My heart jumped. I lay still, eyes wide in the dark. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was the rain or a loose branch knocking against the cabin. The next day, the weather cleared. The sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light over the damp forest. I decided to walk to the nearest ranger station, about 4 miles down the dirt road, to check in and maybe get some information about the area. I packed a small bag with water, some snacks, my flashlight, and my knife. The forest felt alive and welcoming in the sunlight. Birds sang and small animals rustled in the undergrowth. The trail was well worn, and I passed a few signs marking the path. I felt better out here in the open, away from the tight walls of the cabin. About halfway to the ranger station, I noticed something odd on the ground. A small pile of stones arranged in a circle. It looked deliberate, like a marker. Nearby, I found scraps of torn cloth and some broken branches, arranged almost like a crude arrow pointing toward the deeper woods. I felt a sudden chill, the sunlight dimming in my mind. What was this? Was someone trying to mark a trail? Or warn of something? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked over my shoulder but saw nothing but trees. I kept moving, deciding not to follow the markings. The last thing I wanted was to wander off the path. As I walked, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt, narrow and deep, as if a small vehicle had passed recently. Strange, because the road was supposed to be little used and rough. I finally reached the ranger station, a small wooden building with peeling paint and a faded sign. The place was empty. The door was unlocked, so I went inside and found a map pinned to a bulletin board, some weathered pamphlets, and a logbook. There was no one around, no sign of life. I sat down and read the logbook. Entries from the last few months mostly reported normal wildlife sightings and occasional lost hikers. But near the bottom, a recent entry caught my eye. Unexplained footprints found near Lake Cabin. No tracks leading away. Ranger investigating. My pulse quickened. That had to be the cabin I was staying in. I felt a wave of unease. The footprints were found and no one saw them leave. What was going on? I left the ranger station quickly, deciding not to linger. The sun was setting, and I wanted to get back before dark. On the way back, I stayed alert, noticing every sound. The crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, the hoot of an owl far off. When I got back to the cabin, it was already dark. I locked the door and windows, double-checked the firewood and stove, and ate a cold dinner. I couldn't get the footprints out of my mind. Had someone been near the cabin while I was out? Was I really alone? That night, the strange noises began. Footsteps outside, soft at first, then louder, circling the cabin. I lay flat on the bed, heart hammering, holding the knife tightly. The footsteps stopped. I heard breathing, low and uneven, just beyond the window. I didn't dare look. The cabin felt smaller, the shadows thicker. I kept my flashlight in hand, ready to shine it out the window if needed. Hours passed. The footsteps returned briefly, then faded into silence. At dawn, exhausted and trembling, I finally fell asleep. The next morning, I found marks on the outside of the cabin, scratches on the wooden door and the frame. Someone had been here, no doubt. I inspected the ground around the cabin and found more footprints, big, heavy, like boots, leading to the backwoods and disappearing among the trees. Fear clashed with stubbornness. I wasn't going to leave without answers. I packed my bags carefully, ready to leave immediately if needed, but first I wanted to explore a bit. I followed the boot prints into the forest, keeping close to the cabin but moving deeper along a faint trail. The forest grew denser, and I had to push past low branches and thick bushes. The footprints led to a small clearing where I found the remains of a campfire, cold but recently used. Nearby, broken branches and flattened grass suggested someone had hidden here. Then I noticed something else. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the noisy city and spend a week alone in the wilderness. I was 28 at the time, working a desk job in Minneapolis that left me drained by the end of every day. The endless buzz of traffic, the glare of fluorescent lights, and the endless interruptions had worn me down. I wanted to escape. Just me, a cabin, and the woods. I found a small, old cabin for rent deep in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, near a little lake called Mirror Lake. The place wasn't fancy or modern. It had no electricity, no running water, just a small wood stove, a well, and a lantern. Exactly what I wanted. No distractions, no noise, just silence and the sounds of the forest. The drive there was long. I remember leaving early on a Sunday morning, packing my old Honda Civic as full as I could with supplies. Canned food, fresh water, a small fishing rod, a basic first aid kit, matches, a thick blanket, and some books. I also brought a fully charged cell phone, even though I wasn't sure if there would be any signal out there. I told myself it was better to be safe. The last 10 miles of the road were gravel and dirt, winding through dense pine and birch forests. The further I drove, the quieter it got. No radio, no passing cars, just the crunch of gravel beneath my tires and the occasional call of a bird or a distant woodpecker. When I finally reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin was small, about 20 by 20 feet, made of weathered logs with a tin roof. There was a small porch with a single rocking chair that creaked in the breeze. The windows were dirty, and the door's paint was peeling. Inside, the air smelled musty but fresh at the same time, like wood and earth. There was a small kitchen area with a rusty sink and a tiny counter. The wood stove sat in the corner, with a pile of chopped firewood stacked neatly beside it. The furniture was simple: a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress. On the wall hung a faded calendar from 1995, left by the previous renter or owner. I set my bags down and lit the lantern, its soft yellow glow filling the room. Felt good to be alone here. No responsibilities, no noise, just me and the quiet woods. The first night was peaceful. I built a fire in the stove, boiled water for tea, and sat by the window watching the stars. The lake was calm, its surface smooth as glass. I fell asleep to the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The next day, I woke early and walked to the lake. The water was chilly but clear. I tried fishing but caught nothing. I spent the day reading, chopping wood, and exploring the nearby trails. I felt free, the kind of free I hadn't felt in years. But on the third day, things started to feel different. It began with small things. I noticed some footprints in the soft dirt near the cabin. They looked human, but they were too large to be my own. I had taken off my boots outside, so it couldn't be me. The footprints led away from the cabin into the woods and then disappeared. I tried not to think about it. Maybe it was an animal track or a hunter passing by. The forest wasn't private property after all. That night, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a branch scraping against the cabin. But then I heard footsteps. Heavy, slow steps circling the cabin. I froze, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or a bear, though bears don't walk so carefully around cabins. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it outside, but the woods were dark and thick. Nothing but shadows. I stayed awake most of the night, fire burning low in the stove, listening to the sounds outside. The footsteps stopped at dawn. The next day, I found something strange on the porch. A small pile of rocks arranged in a circle. I didn't remember putting them there. I moved them aside, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I started locking the cabin door with an old rusty bolt I found in the kitchen. I felt silly doing it, but I couldn't shake the unease. On the 4th day, I planned to leave. I packed my bags early, ready to get back on the road before dark. But when I went to start my car, the battery was dead. I hadn't left any lights on, so I knew it wasn't my fault. The car had been acting up lately, and the remote location didn't help. I had no choice but to stay one more night. As evening fell, the forest seemed alive with noise. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, distant growls that I couldn't place. I stayed close to the cabin, gathering firewood and preparing a strong fire. Then I heard voices. Not loud, just murmurs like people talking quietly far away. But I didn't see anyone. The forest was empty. I told myself it was probably hunters or campers nearby, but something didn't feel right. I didn't sleep that night. In the early hours, I heard a loud banging on the door. Someone was trying to get in. My heart raced. I grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen and stayed hidden in the back room. The banging stopped after a few minutes, and I heard footsteps running away into the woods. I was terrified but knew I couldn't just stay hidden. The first light, I checked outside. The porch was scratched up badly, deep gouges in the wood from something sharp. On the ground near the door, I found a small piece of torn cloth caught on a nail. It was dark green, like hunting clothes. I realized someone had been watching me, maybe following me since I arrived. But who? Why? I thought about calling the police, but I was so far out that the signal was weak, and it might take hours for them to get here. I knew I had to get out before nightfall. I grabbed my backpack and headed toward the road, about 3 miles away. The forest felt different now. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. I kept my pan ready, eyes scanning constantly. After an hour of walking, I reached the gravel road. I was exhausted, hungry, and scared, but I felt safer out of the woods. When I got to a nearby gas station, I borrowed a phone and called the local sheriff. They said they would send a patrol to check the cabin. The next day, they met me at the cabin. The officers found footprints, broken branches, and evidence that someone had been living rough nearby. A trap line had been set up close to the cabin, meant to catch animals, but also a clear warning someone was guarding their territory. It turned out the forest was a popular hunting ground. Some locals didn't like strangers wandering near their spots, especially isolated cabins that outsiders rented. The sheriff told me they would increase patrols and that the area was safe, but I knew I wouldn't come back. The experience changed something in me. I went back to the city with a new appreciation for safety and a better understanding of how wild and unpredictable the woods could be, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of real people living on the edge, protecting what they considered theirs. The cabin that was supposed to be my sanctuary had turned into a place of fear, but also survival. It taught me a hard lesson. Wilderness isn't just nature. It's people too, sometimes dangerous and unknown. I never forgot that week in 1997 near Mirror Lake. I kept my old pan, the one I carried as protection, on a shelf in my apartment as a reminder. I learned to respect the silence and never underestimate the quiet footsteps in the dark.